Welcome to MUFON Los Angeles. My name is Steve Murillo. I am the State Section Director for MUFON LA. We have a great presentation tonight. Don Ledger, who's going to talk to us about the Shag Harbour incident. Don Ledger is a pilot, a television producer, and the author of 3 books. For the past 10 years, he's also been an active UFO investigator. His most recent book, Dark Object, co-authored with Chris Stiles, explores the crash of a UFO into the water off of Shag Harbour, Nova Scotia, on October 4th, 1967. Mr. Ledger's other 2 books are Swiss Air Down, an investigation into the crash of a Swiss Air Flight 111 in September of 1998. His book, The Maritime UFO Files, is a compendium of 145 UFO reports from the 30s to the present day on the east coast of Canada. Don is a regular contributor to the Toronto-based radio show Strange Days Indeed, hosted by Errol Bruce Knapp. He has been involved in half a dozen television documentaries dealing with both the Shag Harbour incident and UFOs in general, as well as numerous radio shows in both Canada and the United States. Recently, Don became the Canadian technical affiliate for NARCAP, the National Aviation Reporting Center for Anomalous Phenomenon, based in the United States. In his presentation to MUFON LA, Don will present new and exciting research surrounding the controversial Canadian incident, an incident that conventional explanations simply cannot dispel. Would everybody please join me in welcoming Don Ledger. Welcome, Don.
Minor adjustment here. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much. I am Don Ledger. I've been actually some of the information on that form, maybe I should have sent a more recent one. I've been investigating the UFO phenomenon now for about 18 years now, I guess. So 8 more than what was mentioned on the promotional blurb there. I thought I'd just mention first why I got into this, because usually I get asked that anyway whenever I do an interview, and it's I suppose important. A lot of people are interested in UFOs, as we've seen, although it doesn't seem to be that much as interesting nowadays to people as it did back up until about the mid-90s. And I'm sure we all have seen a drop-off in memberships and so on to the various organizations. UFO books in particular aren't all that. Well, if you go to the stores now, if you once upon a time you could see two or three shelves on books about UFOs. Now you're lucky to find 2 or 3 copies in Borders. Up in Canada, there's Chapters, and Indigo is another one of the large booksellers. But fortunately, down in at least in my province, where I come from in Nova Scotia, there's always a few copies around. I suppose they're staying loyal to me. But because it's also comes in handy for tourism too, because a lot of people actually go to Shag Harbour now to look at the sheet of water, or the expanse of water where this thing purportedly set down. But I've always been interested to some degree in UFOs ever since I saw that movie in Unidentified Flying Objects that was made back in the 50s. I've been fascinated by them. And curiously enough, in 1967, I was 22 years old, and I was a salesman traveling the roads of Nova Scotia, and I just happened to be in Shag Harbour. It was either the night of the incident or the following night, and saw something myself. And I didn't know anything about the Shag Harbour incident until I returned home on the weekend, and my wife said there was a newspaper report about UFO crashing in the Shag Harbour. Now you'll see the headlines for that as I proceed through my presentation tonight. But I didn't, and she'd thrown out the newspaper by that point, so I never did get to read it back then. And I said, well, that is weird, because I saw something weird in the sky when I was down there, too, off at Cape Sable Island, which is right next door to Shag Harbour. And it was a series, it wasn't very spectacular, but it was unusual. I haven't been a pilot all my life. I've been a pilot for about 27, 28 years now. But ever since I was 4 years old, I've been an airplane nut. And so I knew what airplanes could do and what they couldn't do, and they couldn't do what I was seeing in the sky this particular night, a series of maybe a dozen red lights zipping around the sky doing crazy things. This was at 3 o'clock in the morning. And I was traveling late at night to get to the next, I left home early, or late in the evening to get down to, so I could be at a music store. I was selling musical instruments actually in Shelburne in the Shag Harbour area. Shelburne or Shag Harbour is in Shelburne County. And I pulled over to the side of the road at 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll let you guess why that happened. And while I was standing there, I saw these things in the sky out over Cape Sable Island. But anyway, that sort of twigged my interest. Nothing much happened other than me reading a lot of books, as a lot of us do, over the years. But more and more I became more serious about the phenomenon, particularly after I got the kids married and out of the way and so on. The job I worked at, Steve mentioned that I was a television producer. I was that and a director and so on and so forth for the province of Nova Scotia. So every day we produced this anywhere from 4 to 12-hour live television show with the members of the Nova Scotia legislature, and we had no control over our talent, as they would say in the business. And anyway, this is what I did. But one of the people I worked with was another department. Was a girl by the name of Diane Stillman. Now I think she's back to her pre-married name because she's divorced, Diane Marshall. And I just happened to mention to her one day that I'd seen something in the paper the night before about a UFO report in Nova Scotia. I said, you know, that really interests me. Sometime I might have a look at that. She said, I saw one when I was young, when I was a teenager. I said, what do you mean? And she said, well, me and 4 of my friends were returning from a junior high school dance, middle school as they call it now, dance, Prince Andrew Junior High. And actually, they were in junior high, but they'd gone to the high school dance, and they were coming back. They were 15 years old, and they were coming around an area called the Rotary in Dartmouth, which is right across the capital city of Nova Scotia, Halifax. And it wasn't completed yet; it was in construction. When all of a sudden, the sky just lit up above them, and this is what got me. And they were just sort of transfixed. They stopped, and they were looking up, and it was almost like Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They said it was huge. They figured it was probably 120, 150 feet across. It was all lit up on the bottom and just lit the road up and everything around them. They were just transfixed standing there, their hair sort of staticky and hair standing up in their arms and so on, and on the back of their neck getting goosebumps. And they were just frozen. And slowly it started to rise up. Then the big bottom light went out, and then the lights around the edge of it came up and around the rim of it, and it just slowly kept going up into the sky, and then left very fast, like is normally reported in some of these cases. So I was kind of, just sort of caught me off guard. Nobody ever reported or ever mentioned to me they'd ever seen a UFO before. Now, and to be honest with you, up until about the late 80s, I was almost of the mind that the only people that saw UFOs were you Americans. I didn't realize until I really got into the investigation of this thing that these things were seen all over the world, and that there was thousands and thousands of sightings in Canada. It must have been kept a closely kept secret, because I never read any books from Canada about UFOs. Everything I ever read was like, Incident at Exeter and, some of the APRO books by Coral Lorenzen and Jim Lorenzen and so on and so forth. But I was sort of like whacked in the head with a 2x4, to be honest with you, to find out how many sightings there were in Canada. And when I got involved in the UFO investigation at Shag Harbour, excuse me, that's when I really found out what was going on in Canada, because we had done a lot of research looking for documents, looking for Shag Harbour documents, and we found all kinds of other documents as well. So anyway, she told me about this. And then maybe the following week there was a write-up on third page 3 or 4 of the Halifax Chronicle Herald, the biggest paper in the Maritimes. Maritimes are maritime provinces up in Canada, the ones over on the Atlantic coast just above Maine. And there's 3 maritime provinces in Newfoundland and Labrador over on the east coast. And Nova Scotia, New Brunswick. New Brunswick is right, Nova Scotia is attached to New Brunswick, which is where Stanton Friedman lives now. He's actually an American, but he lives in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And there's this big island up there called Prince Edward Island that's sort of a tourist attraction. But anyway, the maritime provinces, there was this newspaper report about reports about UFOs across Canada, and I read a few of them. They were fairly interesting, and it was probably about 2,000 words in the paper. But at the very end of it, one of the RCMP officers they'd been talking to, Royal Canadian Mounted Police, I'm sure you probably all heard about the Mounties. This particular officer said that he'd investigated this report by a citizen, and he said, I thought I smelt the smell of marijuana upon his person. So right off the bat, you get this whole article, and right at the very end you get this little bit about marijuana, and that set the tone for the whole piece. In other words, only people who smoke marijuana or drink or something like that are going to see UFOs. Now we all know that's nonsense, but still in all, it tainted the whole piece. And ever since then, every time I read about UFOs in the newspaper, there's always something in there to denigrate to make the story a little less than serious. And last week that happened concerning. Good God, I can't remember what it was about. I actually got it. Somebody had reported, had written a piece in the National Post in Canada. It's printed in Toronto. I'll try to stop popping my peas here. I'm trying to remember the premise of the story. Isn't that awful? Short-term memory's going. So anyway, this particular piece sort of outraged me, so I wrote a piece to the editor about that piece that was in the paper, and these two college professors from Toronto who had pretty much poo-pawed it and said, well, it's people that are delusional or whatever, or it's only of interest to children, and the general population or something like that, not to science. And of course, that's not true. We know that's not true. But anyway, so when I wrote that rebuttal, it went into the paper as well. So I've done that maybe 40 times and got maybe seven times it showed up in newspapers where they've actually printed that as a rebuttal or a letter to the editor or whatever. So anyway, I got this bee in my bonnet about investigating UFOs shortly after that story that Diane had told me. And at that time, I figured, well, the best bet was to join MUFON. So I did. And I took a few reports. In the meantime, several months later, I got a back from Texas. My God, what's his name? Who was the fellow? Andrus? What was his first name? Walter Andrus, the national director for MUFON. I got a letter back from him, and I became a member. And then shortly after, I got another letter advising me that there was somebody else in the area too who had just joined. Actually, a month before I did. His name was Chris Stiles. So Chris and I got together, and we kicked around what we would do in our area, since we were the only ones, it seemed, in eastern Canada that was looking at UFOs, or were going to be looking at it. And he started telling me about this incident that happened back in Shag Harbour in 1967, and how he'd started to look into it. He was only 12 years old. He's 10 years younger than I am, but he was 12 years old at the time when the incident happened. And as he got into the story, it started to twig my memory, and that's sometime probably afterward, an hour afterward, I suddenly realized that he was talking about this incident that had happened while I was in that area back at the time. So I thought that was kind of strange and coincidental, but then a lot of things have happened ever since I've got into the UFO investigation business, coincidental and strange, and they just seem to go hand in hand, these synchronicity that goes on in this business. So anyway, he had already been working on this for about 12 to 14 months when he dragged me into it. He was so enthusiastic, he kept bringing it up, and you should get involved in this, and so on and so forth, and he'd found some documents and so on. But he started off the newspaper reports, and then he found out that if he went to the National Research Council in Canada, who were supposed to be investigating UFO sightings, so that they gave that up in 1994. They never did investigate them. They just filtered out fireball and meteor sightings for science. So maybe they could track down a meteor somewhere, but they threw the rest of them they weren't interested in. And he went looking for any documents that might have arisen from the Shag Harbour incident, and sure enough, he found some. So once he got in touch with me, he hadn't been able to find the Mounties at that point that were involved in this sighting, and some of the other witnesses, lighthouse keepers, radio officers that were with the Canadian Navy at the time. They were handling traffic, and I stumbled across them. Well, I found the Mounties through pretty exhaustive investigation and having to go through pensions and funds and so on, because this happened in 1967. They were all retired now. But I did find them, and they all confirmed that they had seen this thing, and which will become applicable when I get into the actual story of it. So anyway, that's what we did. In the meantime, I'd had so many reports of sightings of UFOs around the Maritimes. This is when I went to the library loaner system and got the microfilm for UFO reports that the National Research Council had kept. And there was about 7,700 of them. And if you go by rule of thumb, you know, that probably equates more like to 77,000 UFO sightings that probably had been ongoing. Because usually only 1 in 10 reports them. And here we had 7,700. I went through all of them. It took me 3 months, and then I weeded out all the sightings around the Maritime Province, Newfoundland and Labrador, and kept them for future reference, and eventually wrote a book about it. That was that Maritime UFO File, the first book I wrote. And it's no longer in print now, but it had, I put 140, I had 170 in there, but they cut out a few of them, and I ended up with 145 cases in there. But most of them are RCMP sighting or military, Air Force, and they're on government they were government documented. So this, having seen those reports in the first place, I was, to be honest, flummoxed about the number of sightings. I had no idea until I got into this business that Canadians were seeing them on the same percentage basis as Americans were. And that there was a history. There was the whole GNAPS 146E thing with service reports and the Air Force and looking at this thing and doing investigations down here, attic and so on and so forth. I had to learn all of this. And read the history on it. There's a few books in Canada of the history of the UFO phenomenon in Canada, but not much, and it's not very very in depth. But of course in the United States there's a ton of material down here, and it took a long time to get the background, you know, and find out what was going on here with the Air Force and investigations and the various sightings and so on. So you sort of have to look at all of this stuff so you can slot your sightings in with theirs and say, well, you know, after a while you get to see a pattern when you're interviewing witnesses and so on, and they say certain things that that you don't normally read about in the books, and you try to keep them to yourself anyway because you don't want to get out there, because it's sort of like the detectives, you know, they get a serial killer or something like that, or whatever, to avoid people being copycats to this. They'll withhold a certain amount of information so they know when they get the real perpetrator and he gives them the details, they'll know that they got the right person. Well, in a way, you can do that with ufology too. Certain little tells and so on that people do tell you about, but you don't normally see them written up in the reports. And so in the meantime, before I actually got into the writing of the book, about 3 years later, I did quite a few UFO investigations in and around Nova Scotia, I guess about 50 or 60 of them. And there's some really interesting cases, really close encounters, abductions. I have 12 people now that constantly contact me about their problems with abduction and so on, and I don't pretend to have any expertise in that area other than that I know I'm pretty well versed on the phenomenon, but all I can do is advise them that you're not crazy. There's an awful lot of this going on around the world, and that seems to help, but they just sort of keep me updated. And but anyway, I've spent a lot of time writing and doing magazine articles. I retired recently from the provincial government where I was doing that television thing back in 2004, and now I've been pretty much dedicating myself to writing articles about UFOs or aircraft. Being the pilot, I like to write about airplanes too, and getting them into some of the aviation publications. I'll get on with this now. I'll get started with it with a little bit of a setup first. The Shag Harbour, you'll see this on the map a little bit later, when the actual incident initially happened back in 1967, October 4th, 1967, at around 25 after 11 in the evening, it stirred up a real hornet's nest. This thing went on for in the newspapers for 3 and 4 days of the actual investigation going on in Shag Harbour, and there were several articles written about it. Fate magazine had an article years and years ago. It was in the National Enquirer and some other publications in the United States. Saga magazine, I believe, had something on it as well. Over the next year and a half or so, and then it just died until Chris stumbled across it again, and that was after he saw a replay of the Sirocco incident. Socorro incident. That was on what's the name of that show? Was Robert Stack? Something Mysteries. Unsolved Mysteries, yeah. They actually did a pretty good reenactment of that. They had some pretty good graphics on it for the day. And this was had been on in 1992 on television, and late in the year, and then earlier the next year they replayed it, you know, when they're before the season ended. And Chris happened to see that one, and that's when he remembered this incident that happened in Shag Harbour, because his grandfather had lived in that area at the time and called him about it the next day. And Chris called up Stanton Friedman, said he wanted to investigate a UFO case. He'd been part of a of MUFON at that time, and he knew Stanton Friedman lived in New Brunswick. He'd seen him at a lecture, and he asked him how he should get started on this. So Stanton gave him a few tips and so on, and he started looking into it. Stanton told him go looking for newspaper files, and if there's fishermen witnesses down there, he says fishermen don't tend to move around. You know, once they're in a harbor somewhere with their boat, that's where they're going to stay for the rest of their lives. And this proved to be true. And Chris started out in that area, and then eventually he found the original library loaner, or the documents stash at the National Archives in Ottawa, which is the capital of Canada, and that had come from the National Research Council. So anyway, after he dragged me into this, and I say I got involved in the investigation of it myself and started looking around, looking for more witnesses and so on, we finally put together what had happened during that time, and then what appeared to have happened was an ongoing thing which nobody else knew about until we stumbled across it, and through one of the witnesses and one of the divers who was supposed that we thought was going to be on scene at the Shag Harbour incident, and but it didn't turn out to be the case. So I'm going to get started on that now, and I'll bring you up. I'll go in chronological order here, and keep you in line, sort of get a good line going here. Anyway, you've had a lot of time to read that one. Next one, the Royal Canadian Air Force called it a UFO. Now, there's a reason I put that up there, and then referred to it later in their documents as a dark object, and that's the book that's out. One of your members here tonight mentioned to me that he tried to find it on Amazon, and they said that it was no longer available, which I don't know what's going on there, because I can still order copies myself. I would have brought some down here, but it's so hard to get stuff across the border nowadays, particularly for flying. You have to order it well ahead of time, and then I have to ship down here and hope it got here. So I just didn't want to bother messing around with it in this particular case. If I'd have known it was going to be a problem, though, I would have made more of an effort. And but it is out there, I guarantee you. I've seen coppers at Borders and Barnes and Noble down here. My wife and I have traveled extensively in the United States over the last 20 years, so I run across this thing has been out since 2000 and year 2000, I think, and so I don't think they're out of copies. I understood the first print was 55,000. So that top part is cut off up there. The red part. If you actually see the book, you'll see Whitley Strieber's name on top of them. On top of it, it was part of his government cover-up of 4 books. This one's Shag Harbour incident, the UFO briefing document by Don Berliner and Bob Pratt and Philip Umbrigno, and the other one by Dr. Lear about implants, and there's the other one is the Fatima incident by Matheson. I can't remember his first name now. But anyway, those 4 books came out, and they were under the under Whitley Strieber's name. And But anyway, the Royal Canadian Air Force called it a UFO. Let's just remember that, and I'll move along here. There's Nova Scotia. I also have a little pointer here too. Shag Harbour is right there. I don't know if you can see Shag Harbour on there, but it's there, right in this area right here. I lived up in this area here. This is Halifax, where the capital city is. Right now, it's probably about 450,000 people. In the whole province, there's about 935,000 people living there. As you can see, there's a lot of seacoast ports around here. There's fishing is a big thing in Nova Scotia. Always was and still is. A lot of lobsters and for years cod, but the cod fishery's dying now. New Brunswick's right here. Maine is right over here. As a matter of fact, where I live is on a little lake right about here, and it's directly across from Kennebunkport, Maine. We're on the same latitude. And there's a highway right here. You can see it's running along. It's called Old Highway 3. Now, there's new highway running along here, 4 lanes to get into the Yarmouth area. They run around the province up here. But the old highway number 3 is still there, and it pretty much looks the same as it did back when I was selling back in 1967. On the night of the Shag Harbour incident, it wasn't just one incident. There was maybe 50 different incidents around the province, or at least on the southwestern. Let me go back for a second. I'll show you something there. Oh, that's right. I've got about a 1 second delay, don't I? Before there it is. Now watch it go again on me. This portion of the province, from about here across to here. All of this section down here, there was a flap went on that night. We called it the night of the UFOs in the book. And there was, well, I'll leave that map up for a minute. Here in the Bay of Fundy, there was a big incident here, which might have been related to the Shag Harbour incident that night, because it was just a bit earlier, about between 11 and 10 after 11 in the evening, of 2 UFOs over a herring seiner fleet. Herring seiner fleets, there was about 14 vessels out there, and each one of them had a crew of about 8 on them. They're all lit up at night, and what they do is they're seining mackerel and other fish in the Bay of Fundy when it's high tide. And they were working along this coast here, and there was about 14 of them around in one big area, and as they're coming together, they're sort of herding the fish into these seines, which are nets, and they end up with this huge big round net that drops down about 300 feet in the water, and close it all up, and then they start pulling the fish out of it. The fishermen that were in this little fleet all of a sudden noticed this one object in the sky that appeared to split into 2, and then that started making maneuvers up and down the coast here, right down to here, right at Westport. See that? There's a little, it's almost like a little island off the tip of this neck of the Digby Neck here. And they were listening on a marine radio, some of the people down there, and they could hear them talking and getting really excited because these things seemed to be diving down and buzzing the vessels. And the fishermen were really excited. One thought was one of these things was going to crash into them. They were seen as far away as over here as Graham and Ann Island, which is just off the northern Maine border, which is right over about here. And in the meantime, there was more sightings up around Lunenburg area here. I've got a picture of one of them, and which I'll show you shortly. And over here, there was another object that was seen leaving the water and climbing out and away by well, there was about 8 or 9 18-year-olds out having a party that night. They'd won a football game or something, and they were having sitting around probably drinking some beer illegally, and but they were at the same time watching boiling up wieners or cooking hamburgers or something. They were right on the coast up in this area here, up around what's called Clark's Harbour, and they saw this thing, football-shaped, lead and gray object climbing out of the water, climbed up and went up into the sky. And then when I got that report, was years and years later after the book came out, as I got tons of reports after the 2 UFO books came out. In this particular instance, he was now a captain in the Canadian Air Force, so it gave it more credibility. And he admitted that, you know, they'd had a couple of beers, but he said that we didn't, you know, that I don't think that had anything to do with eight or nine of us, you know, a mixture of guys and girls over there partying, when all of a sudden everybody went into shock silence and watched this thing climb up away from the water. But he said, none of us ever told anybody about it, and I didn't want to tell anybody about it. And he said, but I couldn't resist after reading the book, and since it was on the same night, because he had it it was in a yearbook where they'd won a football game, and it was on the night of October 4th, 1967. And so it was pinned right down. There was a young fella and his family down here. He sent a letter to the base over here. It's called Greenwood Air Force Base, to the colonel in command over there about him and his mother and his sister watching an object maneuver around out over the water. And he asked questions to the commander at the base, and the base forwarded it to APRO in the United States. And there was a little report written up about it, but nothing came of it. But I have copies of the kids' report. It's a 3-page handwritten report to the colonel, or to the commander of Greenwood Air Force Base. And the guy did answer him, but told him he'd send it off to APRO in the United States. Nothing more ever came of it, of course. But there was many other smaller sightings. The one down in Lunenburg I'll tell you about, in a little place called Puffy Cup Cove. But where it really gets critical, and there was sightings of a fireball that looked pretty much the color of my pointer there in Halifax Harbour that night. And that was that next picture I showed you. And this is how Chris Stahl gets involved, who's my co-author of the book. Now, I graphic this up on a computer, so this is in Halifax Harbour, on the Dartmouth side of the harbour, an area called Smith's Cove. And there's slips there where they do repair vessels and so on. This little thing over here represents a Coast Guard boat and a Department of Transport building over here. And there's this little swing around here. Chris Stiles, this is supposed to be him here. He was 12 years old at the time. Was in his house up a hill in Dartmouth, looking out the back. He was practicing guitar. He's a really good guitar player, and he was looking out the upstairs window of his house out over the harbor when he saw this orange light coming up the harbor. This would be to the east, off out into the Atlantic. This thing was very tiny when he first saw it. This is called McNabb's Island out here. Got a lighthouse on it, and this is Halifax over on the other side over here. Even then, you know, there was probably, I don't know, 300,000 people living over there, and about 70,000 in the Dartmouth side here. So anyway, he got all excited about watching this light, and so he ran out of the house. It's 10 o'clock in the evening. He goes running down the hill, all out of breath, finally gets to this cove here. Dartmouth Cove is actually called, but there's some call it Smith's Cove, others call it Dartmouth Cove. And he comes to the edge of the water. By that time, this thing had worked its way into the point where it looked to him to be about 60 feet in diameter. Big red, huge orange ball. He said like a red-hot poker. That was the color of it. And it went around here in the cove and then went up past the vessel. The vessel's parked over here and then made its way out the harbor. And now he didn't know what to make of this. He got caught hell from his parents for taking off and running out of the house at 10 o'clock in the evening. And but the next day there was reports in the news, in the Herald of Halifax Herald of 2 other people having spotted this big orange ball out on the harbor that was moving around the harbor and then disappeared out towards the east. So you know, there was some credibility there as well. To get back to that other picture again, or the picture of the province. There it comes. There was a series of reports that started here, not only the ones out on by the herring seiners, but some RCMP officers and some other people through this area of seeing a huge an object coming slowly across the sky and very silently. And the ones right here in an area called Weymouth, South Weymouth, were 1 RCMP officer and 3 wildlife officers in Nova Scotia who had an area, a barren, staked out, looking for deer jackers or deer poachers, whatever you want to call them. I don't know what you call them down here, but they call them deer jackers in Nova Scotia. And because it was hunting season, but some of them go out at night, and shoot them using a big, powerful light. Well, they did in those days, and it was fairly it could be a bit of a commercial venture too, because deer meat sold pretty highly on the New York market if they could get them down there. But anyway, they were sitting there waiting, keeping the area staked out, talking quietly, drinking coffee, sitting in a van. And all of a sudden, it got really quiet. Ian Anderson, the Mountie, who was there, told me, he said, it got really quiet all of a sudden. And he said, all of a sudden, we all realized we're staring up at the sky and looking at this light crossing across the sky and going down to the southeast. Didn't know what to make of it. He said, but the next day I went down to see Bert Green, who was the chief game warden at that time, who was living in Digby, right up in here. Or no, sorry, Bear River. And he said, well, look, I drew this on a map here. Did you hear about what happened in Shag Harbour last night? And Ian said, no, I didn't hear anything about it. And he said, well, we were watching this thing, and I put a line across the clearing where we were on one of the survey maps, and the direction this thing was heading, if it kept going that way, it would have gone right straight over Shag Harbour. So that was, I think, the sighting. This was about between 10 after and quarter after 11 that evening, and it would be pretty much a coincidence if this wasn't the same object, because this thing wasn't moving very fast. Nobody ever said this thing sped across Nova Scotia, but it was moving very fast when it first came in from a half orbit, from low Earth orbit, from outer space, which is what I'll touch upon later. I know I'm promising a lot later on, but I'll get to it. Now I got to bring you up to speed on something here. I'm giving you little clues as we go along here. This is Halifax here, the peninsula of Halifax. That's Dartmouth over there. There's a big basin there. Right now there's probably about 450,000 people living around that area. This, the harbor and the basin was during both the First and Second World War, where where they made up the convoys before they went over to England. And whether they came from the United States or where they came from, but it was pretty much United States and Canada anyway, they would form up here in the harbors and in the basin. This is quite a big basin up in here, and it's a natural harbor, nice and deep. There's a couple of bridges going across it now, but they weren't there back in World War I and World War II. The reason I'm bringing it up now is in this area right here, back in 1917, two ships collided, the Emo and the Mont Blanc. And the Mont Blanc was loaded with cordite and benzene and percussion caps for cannon shells, just every nasty thing you could think of. And none of these things on their own would have blown up, but this one did, because something set off the percussion caps, which apparently set off the cordite, which set off the benzene, and it set off such a terrific explosion that it was the biggest man-made explosion in the world up until they dropped the bomb in Hiroshima. And what it did is it happened right in here, and it wiped this whole area out right here in Halifax. And it killed about 1,600 to 2,000 people. Well, eventually 2,000 people, but 1,600 people immediately, and another 18,000 people were injured. And it just leveled that whole end of Halifax, and it had to be rebuilt. So that'll become important a little later on. There's a reason why I brought up this particular explosion, because it set off something that happened later on that has to do with the story of the Shag Harbour incident rather than the fact of the Shag Harbour incident. This is the night of the UFOs. This is the one in Puffy Cuff Cove I was telling you about. These are your objects right here, and this is the time-lapse photography taken on Kodachrome 64 slide with a Pentax camera by Wilfred Eisner. He was a professional photographer, but that's not what he was doing that night. They had taken a boat, an old yacht that he owned, a 35-foot yacht, that was in peril of sinking, and he was told by the harbor authority over in Lunenburg to get it out of there, because if it was going to sink, it was going to get in the way. So they towed it over into Puffy Cup Cove, which is right next to Lunenburg Harbor, which is now a historic site. Used to be an old fishing port, but now it's one of these places. It's all painted up and everything looks really pretty. Tourist place. And they dragged it up on the beach there, and they dosed it full of oil and gasoline and set it on fire and figured they'd be out of there within an hour. Well, as it turned out, it's harder to burn a yacht than you would figure, I guess. So they spent from about 2 o'clock in the afternoon to 10 o'clock that night trying to get this thing burnt down to sections where it could just drift off. And in the meantime, Wilfred spotted this thing in the sky, or these what he saw was these two here. He didn't see this little one, but he saw these two here. But they didn't look like that to him. This is a result of time lapse. They were more concentrated and a little bit smaller, and then this one showed up. He had brought a camera with him because he was going to shoot pictures of the fire, but none of his other equipment. So in order to get the time lapse, he put it on one of these, well, a rock just behind these rocks here, and then he put it on the shutter on what do you call it now? When you want the shutter to stay open? It's on B anyway. And he put the rock on that to hold the lens open. He left it open for 5 minutes. And you can see the star tracks here where the stars, you know, the Earth's turning, so the stars are streaking because the camera's at a fixed point, and he took these pictures. This down here is that's a motel, and that's another motel there. Now, the two motels are gone, but the house is still, well, this is part of a house now. But anyway, so he had this thing under wraps for about 27 or 28 years until he saw my first book, the Maritime UFO Files, and he called me up about it. And I went down, I had a look at this thing, sort of blew my mind when I saw it, and plus it was on a slide. All the information was there. This is actually like third or fourth or fifth generation. Anyway, that was fairly interesting. We didn't know what to make of that because this happened at about 9 o'clock in the evening when a lot of the other UFO sightings were happening that night as well. I can't connect this with the 25 after 11 incident. I don't know what was going on over in Nova Scotia that night, but it was kind of weird. As well that night, one of the other UFO reports, if you've seen the WKPI production of the Shag Harbour incident, which was on History Channel up in Canada the other night again, but it's probably been on down here. About the Shag Harbour incident, there's mention of Flight 305, Air Canada Flight 305 spotting a UFO from their position would have been down over northern Maine. They were about 12,000 feet. They didn't put all the information in there, and it was closer. Actually, it was actually over northern New Brunswick, not Quebec, when they spotted their. It so affected them that they actually reported it and wrote up a report on it. And took some time to find it, but there it was. And then years later, I found the guy because we couldn't figure out who the pilot was because on the report there was a fold or something in the page, and the name was obliterated. And then I saw another UFO report by an Air Canada pilot that sort of looked like the same one, except I could see the whole thing, and his name was Guy Charbonneau or Guy Charbonneau. When I checked into that, he'd also had another report of a UFO sighting about a month and a half before that in August over near Halifax with the thing hanging in the sky for 3 days. It was on radar. And they were actually joking about it. Is that thing still there? Yeah, it's still hanging there. For 1 hour short of 3 days. Now, somebody must have went out and looked at this thing. It was supposed to be at 50,000 feet. It was military radar was painting this thing, and so was the airport radar at Halifax International. And I called him up, and he's still alive and kicking, and sailing boats mostly. And but he said, yeah, you know, the one in Shag that we saw that night, I guess of the Shag Harbour incident. He said I wasn't aware of that until much later. He said, but this and this and that other one are the only two I've ever seen. But I saw what I saw, and I won't back down on it. On the night of Shag Harbour, October 4th, 1967, around 20 to 25 after in the evening, Laurie Wickens and 4 girls. Laurie, if you knew Laurie, you'd know why. 4 girls were traveling down the old highway number 3, coming back from Cape Sable Island. I'm on an angle here, so I can't. Cape Sable Island on that. It's over here. I'm too far over. Anyway, Cape Sable Island's right there. Sorry, Cape Sable Island's right here, and there had been some kind of a function at the community center over in Centerville on Cape Sable Island that night, and so they were driving back. Laurie was giving his girlfriend and 3 teenage girls a drive back into Shag Harbour. One of them lived down in Woods Harbour, or 2 of them lived down in Woods Harbour. But anyway, they were driving along through here, along this highway, and they came into Shag Harbour, and that's when they spotted the object in the sky. And there again, this is a drawing I made up, because you can't get pictures of this stuff. It had either 4 or 5 sequentially flashing lights that looked like they were maybe about 18 inches in diameter or smaller than that. This thing was coming in at about a 45-degree angle, diving down towards the water. Not very fast, but it was still coming down towards the water. And so they started following along Old Highway 3 through Shag Harbour, and trying to keep it in sight because there's trees along the edge of the water here. They got into Shag Harbour. They went right along through here to a place called Mary Garren's Point, and they just lost sight of it behind the trees. And as they came around the corner, they thought they heard a bang. One of the girls thought they heard a bang and a whoosh, as she described it, and they pulled off at what's called the Irish Moss Plant. You'll see a picture of that a little bit later. It's still there. It looks just the same as it did back then, but it had a gravelly lot on it, and this thing was right on the edge of the what's called the Sound, on the edge of Shag Harbour. So you can go right to the edge of the water and look out on the water and right across. I have pictures in here later you can look at, and so they were concerned. They pulled over and they looked, and they could see what looked like a pale yellow light floating out on the water. Now, don't forget, this guy's a fisherman. He's only 18 years old, but he's been fishing for 3 years already. And they know where all of the lights are. They know where the lighthouses are. They know where the buoy lights are. And so they thought, well, what's that? And Laurie said, I don't know, I think an airplane might have crashed here. And he said, well, we better tell somebody about it. So the only way they could do it back in those days, it's pretty desolate around that area, you know, or lonely anyway, not so much desolate. So they went down this is Woods Harbor, but here is there's Lower Woods Harbor, Middle Woods Harbor, and then Woods Harbor. You get a lot of those in Nova Scotia, east, west, north, and south. And but anyway, right about here, about a half mile down the road, is called Lower Woods Harbor, and there was a gas station there with a payphone outside. So he gets on the phone and he calls up the RCMP detachment in Barrington Passage. You see Barrington Passage, which is right along here. And just out past Cape Sable Island, there's a detachment there, and that's what they call their stations. And there was one guy on duty that night who happened to be the commanding officer of that detachment. He was a corporal, and Laurie got a hold of him, and he said, "I think an airplane just crashed in Shag Harbour, in the Sound, just off Shag Harbour." And Victor Werbicki was the Mountie. He said, "Who is this?" And he said, "It's Laurie Wickens." He said, "Laurie, you been drinking?" And he said, "No, I haven't been drinking." He got kind of ticked off about that. And he said, "No, me and I got my girlfriend." His girlfriend was 21, and the three girls I'm taking home. He said, "We all saw it." And he said, "Just a minute, my phone's ringing." So he goes to pick up the other phone, and there's somebody on the phone making a report about an airplane crash in Shag Harbour. So he goes back to Laurie, and he gets on. He says, "Give me the phone number there." He gets the phone number, and he said, "Hang up. Stay there, and I'll call you right back." And so he goes back on the other telephone call, and it's a woman over in Mary Garren's Point, name of Mabel Banks, and she says, "I think I just saw an airplane crash into the Sound next to Shag Harbour." "Oh yeah." Other phone rings again, the one he was talking to Laurie on, and there's some guy from Bear Point reports that "I think I just saw an airplane crashing into Shag Harbour." And then a woman and a daughter phone up from Cape Sable Island here and say, "I think we just saw an airplane crashing over in the area of towards Shag Harbour." So he's really taking it seriously at this point. So he says, okay, and he takes down their names and everything. He says he's going to call them back, and then he calls back Laurie Wickens at the payphone, tells them to go back to the area and because Laurie had reported that they saw a yellow light floating out on the water, told them to go back to the Irish Moss Plant and keep an eye on this thing till they got there. In the meantime, he calls up two of his Mounties that are out staking out an area looking for deerjackers. Must have been a common pastime for Mounties back in those days, and tells them to come back to the detachment, which is a distance of probably about 10 miles along here. And so they do. They arrive back. They must have went right by Laurie and them at the Irish Moss Plant because they had to go to get through there. And they went right back to the detachment. Victor Werbicki was coming out of the detachment at the time, putting on his heavy coat because that night was very clear, very calm, but it was cool in the evening, and it would be down there on the coast anyway. and he told the two fellows that they might have an airplane crash in their hands over at Shag Harbour. So the two Mounties go hop in their car and they go tearing off towards Shag Harbour. So then I got to leap ahead again to about 1997. Chris and I are down at Shag Harbour looking for some more witnesses and interviewing some of the ones that are already there, and one of them was Dave Kendrick. And he was one of the ones that he'd shown up in the Fate magazine article and some of the newspaper in the National Enquirer article. For some reason, this guy got picked on to be the spokesman for Shag Harbour back at that time, and he saw very little of it. He and another fellow by the name of Norman Smith were coming across the same road, coming from the same thing that night. They were both 18 years old. Norman Smith, Normie as everybody calls him now, he was the fisherman, and Dave Kendrick was working in a fish processing plant down in that area. So they're coming along old highway number 3, and all of a sudden they see this thing coming down out of the sky at about a 45-degree angle. It's pretty much described what Laurie Wickens, who incidentally, his nickname is Dickie, they described the same thing, but they weren't that close to the harbor. They stopped, pulled off the side of the road, and they watched this thing coming down, and going down past the tree line from where they were. They weren't that. They hadn't arrived at Shag Harbour at that point. Dave Kendricks was doing the driving, and they had a Chevy too, and Norm was sitting in the passenger seat, so he had a better look at it while they were driving. Then they got out of the car and had another good look at it. Anyway, Dave Kendrick drives Norm home, drops him off right here at the edge of Shag Harbour, and then he takes off home, tells his mother the weird thing they saw in the sky, and then he goes to bed, and that's it for him. But yet he gets a lot of press time over the first 2 years of this thing. In the meantime, Norm Smith, who nobody ever heard of, after we were talking to Dave down there, interviewing him about what he'd seen that night, and he mentioned that he was with Norm Smith. And I said, "Who's Norm Smith?" And he said, "Well, he's my cousin." And he said, he saw it too. He probably saw it more than I did, and he was out in the boats and everything then. I said, "Good Lord, we never heard of him." So anyway, he said, "I'll call him. I can get him over here if he's home." So yeah, get him over here. And I had the tape recorder with me. I taped all the witnesses when they were talking. Anyway, he brought Norm Smith over, and sure enough, Norm that night after Dave dropped him off said he was walking into his house, and then all of a sudden he saw the thing again. I thought, well, my God, this is weird. And so he goes running into the house, and he tells his father. And his father's just getting ready to go to bed, comes running out with a jacket and pajamas on, and they're staring at this thing just as it goes down behind the tree lines. Now, at that point, and this is when I started to smell a bit of a rat. I couldn't figure out what was going on here. And by a rat, I mean some weird thing going on that we didn't understand at first. As they're standing out there, had just witnessed this thing going down behind the tree line, all of a sudden 2 Mountie cars go tearing by, heading for Shag Harbour. Those are the 2 Mounties that have already gotten a report about the thing crashing in Shag Harbour, yet at almost the same moment, these 2 guys are watching something going down into the harbour. Now, this is like maybe 15 minutes later or 10 minutes later. That was impossible. And when I mentioned that to Chris, and I said, the timeline doesn't make any sense here. How could they see it going down behind the tree line, and the 2 Mountie cars are already heading over to Shag Harbour? And we didn't know what had happened that night until later on we figured it out. Because of the story that was told later, we call it a story because there's no documentation on the second half of the Shag Harbour incident. You're following along with me, are you? Raise questions if you want to, if I'm getting ahead of you or sort of confusing you. It's a confusing incident. There's Norm Smith in the middle, the one that's in shape there. Actually, from my side here, I look pretty thin from over here because the screen's pretty thin. But this is Chris Stiles, and this is me with my mouth open. I look like I'm excited, but I think that's a ballpoint pen in my pocket there. Anyway, Norm Smith is in very good shape. He's about, I don't know, probably just a bit younger than me, maybe 4 or 5 years younger than me, but in a lot better shape than I am. But he's still, he worked as a fisherman for years and years and years, and these guys stay in good shape. and because they, pretty much from the hard work they do. And now, at the time that he was doing this, he was a long haul trucker. He was running fish from that fish processing plant that Dave Kendridge used to work in down to Boston. Just about every 2 days he was on. He was really hard to get a hold of. This, you were watching when we came in here tonight. You were watching when I came in tonight. Some of you came in. You saw that show, the presentation that was on about USOs. The guys that were shooting this UFO incident at Shag Harbour was incorporating one of those in one of their USO shows, his name was John Waltz. He was the director. That's the reason we were there, because he was doing the part about Shag Harbour incident. He had me and Chris and Norm Smith. Now, he already done Chris, but he did me sitting on a concrete rock over here somewhere on the other side of the Moss plant, and he'd interviewed Norm Smith over on a boat. And it might even been in that one. I know Carl Feint was in that, and he was in Halifax at the time. We brought him up, or they brought him up, and interviewed him too for that documentary. There's about, I don't know, 6 or 7 or 8 documentaries now with the Shag Harbour incident on it, or we're being, talking to people. I've lost count of the ones I've done now, just on UFOs, but mainly the big ones on the Shag Harbour incident. There's 2 really good programs about the Shag Harbour incident, but even then they can't get it all in 46 minutes. So anyway, this is Norm Smith, and we got him up that day, and he told us what had happened that night where they were concerned. They named very well, I guess. This is looking out over Shag Harbour and Bon Portage Island. He told us about, of course, him and his father seeing the thing. On the house that they were living in was sort of like a long, what we call a duplex now, although it was one they'd built. And on the other end was Norm Smith's father's brother, Lawrence Smith, who was going to bed at that time and did get to bed, but he got dragged out of bed later because he had to go out looking for, survivors out here on the Sound. Now, this wasn't taken that night. This is a picture some woman took and gave it to me one time. They took it from an airplane. I've got some shots that I took from the airplane myself, too, but unfortunately, when I took mine, it's kind of hazy, so it looks like there's a little fog over the ground. Anyway, right down along here is the area, right about here is where the Irish Moss plant is. She didn't quite get that in. That house wasn't there in the day, but there's a little setup there with a sign and so on that says the Shag Harbour incident, the UFO landed in the water right off this point here. I'll see where we can. There's the sign pointing to right across to the Irish Moss plant on the other side. Now this is one of those foggy pictures I took, but it's been reproduced, and this one's actually just a scan that I took because I had 2 different types of computers and I couldn't get the thing to translate across. There's your Irish Moss plant here. And this is approximate here, about 800 feet out on the waters when they saw it drifting, Laurie Wickens and the girls, and drifting down this way. Now the tide was ebbing that night. We didn't know that until later, of course. This is the western approach into Shag Harbour. Shag Harbour is right in here. The tide was ebbing, so it was flowing out this way, and towards the end of this island, there's a little point out there called the Rip. And the waters get really confused there, and it's quite choppy. But the current can run there as much as 4 knots when the tide's ebbing. And so when they saw this thing on the water, they don't know whether it was under its own power or drifting, but it was moving out in that direction. The thing came down about a 45-degree angle and then started drifting down the Sound, as they call it right here. There's a better picture of it right from the shore. I'm down a little lower there, but I was going to generate a little UFO in there so that you would have been able to have a rough idea of the size of the thing. Yeah, it looked to be drifting or under its own power, drifting along on the surface of the water. I'll give you more details in a few minutes. I'm just looking for, here we go. On the water, it looked like it was either on the water or slightly above it. It might have been, they said, between 10 feet and 12 feet thick in the middle and about 60 feet long. But it was dark, almost like it was in shadow. No moon that night, remember that. But there were lots of stars. And they couldn't be sure if it was drifting or not. And don't forget now, the witnesses thought they were looking at the light on, possibly on a piece of wreckage or a huge airplane that was floating on the water out there before it sank. The Mounties arrived on scene, Victor Rubicki, Ron Pond, and Ron O'Brien, the two Rons. Ron O'Brien was the senior of the two constables, and he was what they called, he used to shift back and forth all the way up and down the coast wherever he was needed. And Ron Pond was the rookie. Ron was sent around to the people, because by this time a lot of people had gathered around this area. About 24 people had shown up. He was interviewing people about what they'd seen. Norma Smith and his father had jumped in the car after the Mounties went by. They figured, well, this thing must have crashed into the harbor after all. So they hopped in their car and they went down and arrived there where the Mountie cars were sitting there with their lights flashing and everything. And Ron O'Brien and Victor Rubicki kept an eye on the thing for a few minutes, and then just as they were about to start going to look, they looked. There was a dory or a rowboat or a fishing boat tied up at the water's edge right behind the Irish moss plant. They use Irish moss, incidentally, in the production of salt and for making iodine and stuff like that, and some colors, I guess. They dye wool with it or something. Anyway, it's not an Irish moss plant anymore, but the plant still, or the place is still there. And so Ron Pond was tasked with given the task of taking down, doing an interview or interviewing witnesses and so on, and writing a report on it. And Victor Rubicki said he was going to go and down the road a piece to one of the houses and make a phone call and see if he could get hold of a couple of fishermen, see if they could get a boat out to go looking for survivors, because they thought that's what had happened too, from what the witnesses were saying. And Ron O'Brien, he asked him to go to the phone and contact the Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax, which is still going, still exists. It's a military thing made up of pilots and naval persons and so on, and they actually just have a center there where they collate information and then send out orders to whatever assets they need to get into an area to start searching for something. It came into, did pretty much the same thing on the night of the Swiss Air Flight 11 crash off Peggy's Cove outside of Halifax. This thing here was almost like a smaller version of that happened back in 1998 with the crash of Swiss Air Flight 111. And but anyway, so Ron O'Brien went off looking for a phone, because they didn't have the radio equipment that we have nowadays. You couldn't just radio through to anybody, or you didn't have cell phones. You had to use the landline if you wanted to get a hold of anybody. So he went in, he called RCC, Rescue Coordination Center, to report and ask if there was any aircraft missing. Because what they do was do an airport search. They'll start calling around to everybody, the forces, and they called right down in the United States and up into Newfoundland to find out if any aircraft were missing. And he left a message with RCC and said to get back to him and let them know if they had any missing aircraft. In the meantime, Victor Rubicki got a hold of Lawrence Smith, who'd gone to bed, drug him out of bed. Actually, they were up late for fishermen anyway, because they're normally up around 3 o'clock in the morning to go and fishing the next day. And it just happened to be that there's another wharf similar to this. I don't have the picture. I didn't get over that far. Another one right up here looks pretty much like this, but it's bigger. And there's a long arm extending out on this is the Prospect Point Wharf, and there's a longer arm sticking out this way. And Lawrence Smith's boat was tied up, the first boat out. He was the last boat in that night, so he would be the first boat out. The next one to him was Bradford Shan's boat, and that's, for some reason, just by pure coincidence, when Victor Rubicki called up for a fisherman, he knew Lawrence Smith, so he called him up, and he happened to be the last boat in. So that was fortunate for him. Lawrence said, "Well, Bradford Shan's tied next to me." He said, "We might need more than one boat," because he told him he thought there was an airplane crash out in the Sound, and they wanted some boats to go out. So he called up Bradford Shan, the Mountie did, and within about 15 minutes, everybody was down at this wharf up here, and some of the people had come back from, like Norman Smith, and the Ron Pond stayed on shore. He was continued to take down statements, and some of the other fishermen, they all went down to the government wharf, as they call it, down here. They got on the first two boats and they steamed out into. These are 45-foot boats, so they don't really steam, but anyway, they're running on diesel. And they went out into the Sound. The distance across from here over to that outer island I showed you there a few minutes ago is about 1.5 miles to 2 miles, because it sort of tapers in out to the east. And so the two boats went out. It's practically pitch black out there, and it's fairly calm, and it's a bit eerie. Of course, now they're expecting, everybody's got knots in their stomach, expecting to find body parts and worse, floating around out on the water out there, or at least, and maybe there's some people that are still out there that are still alive, hanging on to wreckage or whatever. The life expectancy in the waters in the North Atlantic in October, believe it or not, the water's warmer there in October than it is in the summer, because it takes that long for the waters to warm up. And but even so, if you're going to be in that water unprotected, for more than an hour, you're probably going to get hypothermia and die. In the winter or in the spring, you got about 5 minutes and you're going to die. It gets that cold in the water there. But anyway, so they went out to the western approach there, western entrance, and they were about halfway across, to 3/4 of the way across, when they ran across this foamy slick on the surface. A lot of people have asked about this over the years. And Norm was the first boat, and he put the engine in neutral and just sort of drifted towards the stuff. They had the lights on the boat, and they were shining them around. And Bradford Shand, he shut his engine down as well, or put his into neutral too, and idled her. And Norm called across to Bradford. He says, "What do you think of this, Brath?" That's BRAF they called him. And he said, "I don't know what it is." He said, "I don't much like the look of it, though." And I said to Norm Smith when I was interviewing him, I said, "Well, what's this, like sea foam? Did it look like that? Why would you be leery of sea foam? You see it all the time." He says, "Yeah, but not like this." He said, "This stuff was, we went through it. We had to cut through it because we were looking for, survivors. And it was the swath was about 80 feet wide, and we estimated it about 1/2 mile long." He said, "But it wasn't sea foam." He said, "God, we all know what sea foam was. Gee, as he would say, Jesus, by it wasn't sea foam." And he said it looked more like shaving cream sitting on the water with some kind of glittery yellow sprinkling on it. And there was a smell, sort of a sulfury smell around there, and the water was a little roily in places, which was unusual. And so anyway, they did cut into it, much as they didn't much like the idea of it. One of the guys put a dip net over the side, and he dipped it up. And when he brought it up, sea foam would cling. You might even get a little ball of it. And being on the coast here, I'm sure you've all seen, or some of you have seen sea foam. And it's normally got a little seaweed or something mixed in with it, dirt and stuff. But anyway, this stuff came up. It wouldn't stay in the net. It looked thick enough on the water, but when you tried to pick it up, it wouldn't come up off the water. Ron O'Brien, the Mountie, who was out on the boat, when I interviewed him, he said, "Well, I was thinking about maybe we should take a sample." But he said one of the fishermen put his hands over the side into the water, which turned out to be Norm Smith, incidentally. And when he brought it up, he said, "I went over and looked at it," and he said it was just, his arms were just wet. There was nothing on it, and it didn't even seem to be slick. So they thought it was some kind of byproduct, maybe from aviation fuel or from Jet A 4 or 5, 6, something like that, which was, basically kerosene, refined kerosene with kickers in it. But it didn't appear to be that either. There was no smell of jet fuel in the water. During the crash of Swiss Air Flight 111, the smell of jet fuel in the seawater was so bad when they were out looking for bodies out there that not only the bodies were making the searchers physically ill, but the smell of the fuel on the water mixed with the smell of salt water was terrible. They said it was a lot of the hardened fishermen were throwing up, from the smell of the stuff, and probably stress too. Anyway, they drifted through this and they started cutting back and forth. Geez, I forgot to mention, just before they left to go, before Victor Ribicki went to go and call looking for some fishermen to take them out, the light disappeared on the water. Now at that point they didn't know whether it sunk or went underwater on its own violation, but the light disappeared. So when they were out on the water, of course they couldn't see a light out there. There was the budget light and there was the lighthouse up off of Bon Partage Island. They could see that well enough, but there was nothing drifting on the water. They kept cutting across the water, across the sound, all the way through there. Couldn't find anything. But about an hour had passed by that time. The Coast Guard cutter from Cape Sable Island again, which is over in Clark's Harbour, had fired up, and it was such a cool, clear night that Ron O'Brien said you could hear the engines firing up 13 miles away when this thing came across. It took them, it was 13 nautical miles from this point over to Clark's Harbour to Cape Sable Island, and the thing could only do 10 knots, so it took it just over an hour to get there. When it showed up, they called out and asked if Ron O'Brien was there, and Ron O'Brien hailed himself as, yeah, I'm right here. And they said, come over. So he went over and he said, we got a message from RCC in Halifax. They've done an extensive search all the way from Cape Hatteras all the way up to Fox Point, Newfoundland, Cape Race, Newfoundland. And there's nothing, no aircraft are missing. There's no military aircraft reported missing, commercial aircraft, and no private aircraft that we've heard of that's gone missing. So they've been at it for about an hour and a half now, the fishermen. So at this point, they're asking themselves, well, what the heck were we looking for? What happened out here? What did we see? And it was there's Bon Partage Island. That's another shot I took from my airplane. And with the other end pointing out to the east. There's the sort of the setup for that evening of what's going on there. Here's the boat coming across from Clark's Harbour. Here's the object that had come in here, landed on the water, and the fishing boat's coming out from Cape Sable Island, or from Shag Harbour, and the viewpoint from where they saw this thing impact the water. This is a little bigger map. You can see here's Outer Island right here, Cape Sable Island over here. Now it doesn't look like much, but that's you can probably read it from there. Our Rescue Coordination Center in Halifax requests investigation of a subject UFO report. They're calling it a UFO, the fishermen. Remember I mentioned at the very first about the UFO in Shag Harbour? The fishermen and all the witnesses thought it was a crashed airplane, or an airplane crashing. Nobody said, we saw a UFO. We saw an airplane crashing. This is different than your normal UFO incident, whereas most people usually say, well, we saw a UFO, and then the military comes along and says, no, you probably saw Venus or, swamp gas or something like that. But in this case, it's the military that calls it a UFO, and the witnesses are calling it a crashed airplane. So it was just the reverse. But they did take this very seriously. They didn't know for sure. Maybe it was an airplane that crashed, went in the water, and sunk on the bottom. To give you a little history on the bottom there, Sightings did a 4-part program on Shag Harbour back in around 1995. We had to go down for that. And while we were there, the director found out I had an airplane, and he asked if I could go back home to Halifax and get it. So I did. I flew it down to Yarmouth, which is just a little further east and west, pardon me, a little further west of Shag Harbour, and where there's an airport there. So I flew it down there, and then a couple of days later, one of the guys drove me back to the airport. I took the airplane, and the cameraman and their director, he had a little TV monitor in the back, took the right door off the airplane, and we strapped the guy in so he wouldn't fall out. Cameramen will do anything to get a shot. Anyway, he was sitting on the edge of the this is a Cessna 172, incidentally. And I'd taken the seat out and took the door off. So he's sitting there with rain gear on to keep himself from freezing to death. And we had him strapped in, as I said, and we flew down over Shag Harbour, and he shot a lot of aerial stuff. In the meantime, they took some still photographs from the air too, and when you're in the air 1,000 feet over that sound, you can see the bottom just about almost all the way out. It drops off to about 40 feet, and then it levels out down there. And they had cameras over the side, underwater cameras. They filmed the bottom, and all it really is down there is kelp beds and rocks and a sandy bottom, nice and clean. Really surprised me for a seaport, because usually you find all kinds of junk out there. And fishermen are always using, well, they did, they can't do it anymore, but they'd use old car axles or an engine block or anything to make a big anchor if they were going to anchor something out there. But they did a mile-long swath, about a half a mile wide, doing tracking back and forth. We had a magnetic magnetometer, towing a magnetometer over the side, and side scan sonar strips that we took of the whole thing. Found maybe 4 or 5 suspicious looking sites on the bottom there, but each one proved either to be a kelp bed or a rock. There was nothing on the bottom. No indication that anything had been left there or had, if it had crashed, had sunk there. So they spent quite a bit of money doing this. Sightings, I have to applaud them for that. I don't know if any of you have ever seen it. Sightings used to be a program that was on in the mid-90s here. But anyway, didn't find anything on the bottom. So here we have it. This is coming from the Air Desk in Ottawa, which used to be the official UFO reporting. Well, for that time anyway, for about 10 years, it was called the UFO Desk in Ottawa. It was manned by the RCAF, the Royal Canadian Air Force at the time. And Squadron Leader Bain, you can see his name up there, S/L Bain. He was on duty that night, and he's the one that took the initial report. He's the one that wrote the UFO on the paper there. And you can see there's they need officers to dive. I can't quite see it from here. There's quite a few of these things, and they're all telexes ordering equipment and assets down to Shag Harbour to start doing a bottom search. And Bain was Ray McLeod of the Halifax Chronicle Herald, who wrote the story on this thing when it came out on Saturday. Now don't forget, it quickly turned from being October the 4th, Wednesday, October the 4th, to October the 5th, Thursday, within a half an hour after the incident, because the time just rolled over. And so it took the newspaper a couple of days to get up to speed on this. Ray McLeod started doing an investigation. He was told that there was no such thing as an air desk in Ottawa. There was no such person as Squadron Leader Bain, even though he had the reports from Squadron Leader Bain and so on. This is after he'd written the story for 3 days and was taken off the story because he was scaring people. Now, this is scaring people who have been fishing on the North Atlantic Ocean for years and years and years, and lived through, wars and submarines and everything around the coast. I don't imagine they're going to be frightened off by a few lights in the sky. But anyway, this is what he was told a little later on. I just wanted to show you this particular report because it is sort of pivotal. It's a UFO report reported by the Air Desk in Ottawa, which was the official government, and this is 1967. In 1968, by January, February of 1968, the UFO reporting desk quickly disappeared, and it was turned over to the National Research Council. Now, can anybody tell me why that happened? Anything else you can think of happened in January, February, March of 1968? Condon report. It had finished off. Case number 34 in the Condon report, unsolved, is the Shag Harbour incident. Anyway, that had nothing to do with this part, with them shutting it down. But the fact of the matter is the U.S. Air Force had decided that there was nothing to UFOs, so our guys said, okay, the heck with it. That's it for us then. We're no longer, it's not of national security interest. I'm sure you've heard that line a lot down here, as well as in England they've heard it. I often wonder whether they're using the same spokesperson for all 3 countries, but it seemed to be the case. When I wrote the Shag Harbour incident, I had 40 pages of of involvement between Canadian intelligence services and the United States intelligence services going back to the Second World War. Most of you aren't going to know this, but we were really into that, the creepy intelligence stuff back during the Second World War because, well, Britain was in the war, so were we. There was while Churchill was trying to get, and this is sort of germane to this, so just bear with me. While Churchill was trying to get his own government, Neville Chamberlain's government, to recognize the fact that Germany was building up their forces. They were building an air force, they were building a navy, they were building submarines and tanks and everything from 1933 onwards, and the British government wouldn't take it seriously. And of course they were the force to be reckoned with back in those days anyway, at least Navy-wise. And so a Canadian industrialist by the name of William Stevenson had been doing a lot of traveling over in that area, and he was getting concerned about what was going on there. And so he went back and he reported to the British government. He got some people at the Home Office to listen to him for a few minutes and said, listen, you should realize that they're building all kinds of there's a lot of fighter aircraft over there, and they're building submarines and battleships and everything. And the British intelligence wasn't picking up on this, or if they were, they weren't passing it along to Chamberlain, who didn't believe any of this stuff. Matter of fact, he was blown off. So Stevenson got really upset about this. So he went into Parliament and he sat down and he watched the government in action to see who, if anybody, was paying any attention to what the Germans were doing, the build-up in 1933. And he found out that Churchill, who was a backbencher in those days, was indeed making all kinds of noises and pleading with the government to start, building up our forces, because they're going to be a force to be reckoned with in a few years. So anyway, offhandedly, one day after Churchill was finished, he buttonholed him out in the halls and told him what he was seeing in Germany. And he said, somebody has to take this seriously because they are building up their forces in a terrific manner over there. Now, Bill Stevenson was a rich man even then. Bill Stevenson invented the fax machine, which was the forerunner of the fax machine was the thing that they used in the wire services around the world to run newspaper pictures, or rotating. They took a lot longer than our fax machines and our scanners do now. But anyway, he patented this, so I guess his family still gets royalties off of fax machines all over the world. But anyway, he was also wealthy. At any rate, anyway, he had been a pilot in the First World War, and but anyway, he took it upon himself to he bought the best Leica camera he could find in Germany, and the best lenses he could get his hands on, and he started on his trips because he was expected to be in these places because he was an industrialist and drumming up business and so on. So he started taking all of these surreptitious pictures and so on, and he was passing them to Churchill. The only one that was listening to Churchill was King George. Now, King George has no power, all right, but he's just the King of England. So between Churchill and him and Stevenson, they set up this little secret organization called the BSI, the British Secret Intelligence. And they used to refer to themselves the Baker Street Irregulars, which comes from Sherlock Holmes. But anyway, in the meantime, this guy, Bill Stevenson, became even more covert. He cut off all of his business ties, run around destroying all of his photographs, found any evidence of his own existence, and slowly started to wipe it out while he was doing this work over in Germany and in Europe. Eventually, he went deep underground, and when Churchill finally came to power, he called him, in all of his coded messages, he was called Intrepid. Have you ever heard of that? A man called Intrepid, but that's who he was. And so anyway, Intrepid, Stevenson set up in Canada, because they were listening over on our side, he set up this Camp X outside of Toronto and so on, where they were training spies and people who could, geez, I'm telling you, boy, when you get old, your brain just goes. You know, guys that, like the SAS or the Navy SEALs, what do they call them? Commandos? Yeah, commando forces. And they were training over there. Now, what happened, you guys weren't in the war until 1941, but we've been at it since 39. But every once in a while, some of the boys from down in your Army and Air Force, well, they didn't have Air Force, it was the Army Air Force, of course, and even Navy people would take a vacation in Canada, and then they'd disappear for a couple of weeks. And that's where they'd end up at Camp X. And they were learning about what was going on, because they weren't getting this stuff through the regular lines of intelligence, because, you know, there was a determined effort to stay out of the war at that point down here. And but they were learning. Eventually, just before the war, before you guys went into the war, Bill Stevenson went to see President Roosevelt, and who was already in touch with Churchill throughout the war. He was, you know, they were under the table. They were corresponding all the time, and he went to Roosevelt because he already had an office set up in New York, which was a spy network for all through South America and over in Germany and so on. Anyway, he went to President Roosevelt and said, we understand that you're thinking about setting up your own intelligence network, because they were, you know, it was pretty certain, you know, by the government people at that time that they were going to get in the war. One way or the other was going to happen, and it took Pearl Harbor to do it, but it did happen. And but anyway, he suggested that they take this young lawyer who was really bright and kind of tenacious and had just the right kind of personality to set up their own intelligence services. His name was Bill Donovan. They call him Wild Bill Donovan. He started up the OSS, and then which eventually became the Central Intelligence Group, and then went to CIA afterwards. So 1970, Intrepid, who's now living in Bermuda, retired there, was given a special award by Bill Casey, or not Bill Casey, yeah, Bill Casey, I think his name was, who was the head of the director of the CIA at the time, for special services, and was given a plaque and so on, and that had never happened before. So anyway, that was his recognition of what had happened there. Now, I had this intelligence connection thing all worked into the book, because I thought it was important that because of what was going on after the war and up into the 50s, to do with UFO reports and how everybody in the Air Forces and the military and the governments were all spoting the same line despite what everybody was seeing. And because I think the old boy network was in play there after the war, and you know, that comes right from England right through Canada down in the States, or directly between Canada and the United States, and I think it continues to this day. But that comes up a little later on in the story. So I don't want to get too far ahead. These are more documents expanding the search. At one point, it mentions there where they had searched the area thoroughly. By the end of the first day, they were convinced that, you know, they started at 1 o'clock in the afternoon. By 6 o'clock, they were convinced that there was nothing on the bottom. There was nothing there. So Ron O'Brien, who was he's what's called the on-scene commander at the time, even though it's the military that's doing the looking underwater. The divers from the RCN, Royal Canadian Ship Granby, and the Fleet Diving Unit, were still under the auspices of the site commander, who was Ron O'Brien. He was appointed site commander, and because they were still treating it like an airplane crash. And that still extended right through until even during the Swiss Air crash in 1998. But they said they didn't see anything on the bottom. So Ron O'Brien reported that to RCC in Halifax and said there was nothing down there. The divers were going to pull up stakes. This is on a Friday afternoon. And it was no more than about 20 minutes later, he got another radio call that he was required on the phone at the detachment. So he goes back to the detachment, and at the detachment, the RCC tells him, go back, tell the divers on station that they are to stay there until we tell them to stop. Well, he said, why? They said there's nothing down there. He said, doesn't matter, just keep them on site. Keep them looking. So he said, and he told me this in his office. He was, Ron O'Brien, when I interviewed him, was the head of security for New Brunswick Power, you know, the power corporation up there. And I said, you know, I've heard that before from one of the divers, from another diver who told me that they were all finished on the end of the first day. There was nothing down there as far as they were concerned. They even did cable drags along the bottom to see if they could catch it on anything. There was nothing down there. But he said that he thought it was kind of strange that they were ordered to stay on site, you know, even though there was not, as far as we were concerned, there was nothing down there. That'll come up again later. These are more documents. The slip-up document. This one here, I don't want to get into too deeply into this right now, but this document makes a few slip-ups, which leads me to think that this was somebody getting confused with the other half of the Shag Harbour story with the Shag Harbour incident itself. And I can't really see it from here, and I should have had a copy with me. Can't really make it out. But essentially, what you're seeing on there is a contradiction of what they were actually saying later on. There's other documents. Different people had written in. There was a statement from some of the witnesses up in the top right-hand corner there. Can you guys make that out? Or is it blurry? Huh? It's too small, eh? Yeah. The other bigger documents, you could probably see them. I just put them in there as examples anyway, but there's this one here says, oh, I'm using the wrong one. This one right here says that on the bottom here, that they were to take pretty much take the divers off site. That as far as they're concerned, there was nothing on the bottom. And this is a Colonel Turner in the Army who said someday later on I'm going to write a book about this, about the power of negative thinking, because apparently he thought there was something to this. All right, so Saturday, this headline comes out, and surprising everybody. Now, ignore that there. It wasn't blasted by U.S. planes. This is over in Vietnam, another part of the story. But look at this. Now, this is the Chronicle Herald. At this point, that paper had been around for about 100 years. It's a real conservative paper. And yet, they got this title up there. Could be something concrete in Shag Harbour UFO RCAF. Well, that was that Squadron Leader Baines. When Ray McLeod, as you can see his name down here, you might be able to make it out, when he wrote the story, and he was flabbergasted when he came in on Saturday morning and saw the story he'd written the day before showing up as a headline, big headline paper, with big headlines on it in the most conservative newspaper in Eastern Canada. And he said, oh my God, what did I start here? But he'd gotten that quote from Squadron Leader Bain. Well, there could be something concrete in the Shag Harbour UFO. And then he quoted his RCAF. There's a story that goes on in page 2. Now, that's a carbon copy. This is what the headline really looked like in the paper. It was in big red letters. The paper always printed in black and white headings unless there was something really important. Now, Ray McLeod sort of got sucked into this story. He went at it tooth and nail for 3 days, and then he got pulled off the case. So anyway, Chris and I went to Harold Shea, who was the city editor at the time, who okayed this headline and got it into the paper, and asked him, you know, in hindsight, what made you, in a paper like this, come up with a headline like that? How come it wasn't buried on like page 4 or 5 or something? He said about 3 months before this came out, before this incident, he said, my wife and I were coming back up the eastern shore, or the eastern shore of, south shore of Nova Scotia, passing Chester, which is was a fishing village. It's now it's a big yacht squadron and stuff down there now. But anyways, as we were coming by there at 2 o'clock in the morning, this thing came in off the water, this brilliantly blue lit thing, about 100 feet over the car, turned around over the car, hovered there for a minute, and then went back out over the water and scared the hell out of me and my wife, he said. He said, when I heard about this report, he said, I had no qualms whatsoever about putting that headline in the paper. He says, I took you-know-what for it the next day when Eric Dennis, the owner of the newspaper, saw it in there. But he said, my conscience was clear. Anyway, Ray McLeod went at this thing, and he made 2 or 3 other reports in the paper about it, and then he got pulled off because he said Eric Dennis told him, who was the owner of the newspaper, said, you're scaring people. And Well, he said, I'm only reporting what I'm getting from the military. It's not my fault. And he didn't think he was scaring anybody anyway. They put another guy on it who runs one of the, called Frank magazine now, which has been going for about 18 years in Canada, first Nova Scotia and then Canada. It's pretty much a muckraking type magazine that goes after politics and so on, which in some cases they deserve. But anyway, nobody ever gave him much credit for being a great reporter. He just pretty much reported whatever you told him to report, eh? And if you didn't like it, take it out and fix it, you know, this type of thing. So nobody had any respect for him, including Ray McLeod. Ray McLeod now teaches journalism, and he'll show up in that most recent UFO program that was done by WKIP in New York, which is on the History Channel. You've probably seen it, or some people might have. Okay, I just told you about that. Again, the search is to be terminated. Unidentified flying object, they call it. They don't know what it was, and they're pretty much going to give up on it. So here's the Mr. W.A. Small. He was a UFO investigator in Alberta. He had written to we call him the UFO priest. He was a Jesuit priest who was an astronomer at St. Mary's University. He set up the astronomy program in Halifax. There's 6 universities in Halifax. He always denied that he was looking into UFOs or looking, but after he died, all of his papers and everything went to the archives at St. Mary's University, and after a couple of years, and then now it's even easier, we were able to go into the university and find his papers, and there was 3 or 4 boxes, big boxes of UFO reports there that he'd taken and investigated, but he denied ever having anything to do with it. And but he also seemed to be a bit of a power behind the scene. He was a scientist, he was an astronomer, and he seemed to have some clout with the RCMP and so on. So if he said, well, no, this thing was probably going to be this, that, or the other thing, they took his word for it and moved on. And he was a bit of I mean, he wasn't a pain in our butt in later years because he wasn't around, but he was back in those days, I guess, for the other investigators. And it says here, although the Shag Harbour saga seemed to be end with the return of the Canadian Fleet Diving Unit to Halifax, many years later, other details came to light. There's no trace, not a clue, not a bit of anything is not the case. Now we're back to this again. I'll just leave that up there for a minute. Chris Stiles was still investigating around, trying to find some more documentation on the Shag Harbour incident. He thought one of the things that would be neat to have would be the actual divers that were down in Shag Harbour, looking on the bottom. Now, there were rumors after the fact that some of the fishermen said they saw the divers bringing stuff up off the bottom. And I don't give that, I give it credibility, but I don't assign too much to that. I mean, if they saw stuff on the bottom that they didn't recognize, they'd probably pick it up anyway and then drag it up on the boat and get somebody to look after it. But then there's the other story about Mace Coffey, who was worked for the Defense Research Board in Canada. He was a psychologist, having received artifacts from the bottom of Shag Harbour that were taken to the Naval Armament Depot in Dartmouth. Well, I got it up, might as well show it to you. Which would be right about here. And it was like a block away from my house when I was a kid. And then some years later, any of you happen to see the Martin Jessic thing about the giant UFO up in the Yukon? Anybody see that one? Well, anyway, there was a report on that, but there's twin sisters there who live up in that area now, who lived in Nova Scotia at the time, and they sent me a bunch of papers concerning their father, who was a captain in the Canadian Air Force at the time, RCAF, and having been charged with the task of going to the Naval Armament Depot in Dartmouth and receiving some equipment that was put on a small flatbed truck and taken up into New Brunswick, down old Highway 9 into Highway 1 into Maine, and disappeared southward somewhere. So it was taken down into the United States. Now, I don't know what was on board this thing. but I don't think it was a UFO because nobody saw them recovering anything off the bottom other than small pieces. But it might have been something of some importance there. Getting back to our divers. Chris thought it'd be nice to find the divers. So he had a friend, Guy Fenn Jr., whose father used to be the instructor at Fleet Diving Unit in Halifax. His name was Guy Fenn Sr., of course. And so he went to him and he asked him, this is now years later, back in 1994, 93, 94, when we were looking into this thing, said, I'm going to see if I can get a hold of Guy Fenn, or see if Guy Fenn's father would know anything about the divers down there. So I guess Guy Fenn Sr. dug up the name of some divers that were supposedly on the Shag Harbour dive, Navy divers in the Fleet Diving Unit. So he got a list back, five Navy divers. And one of the ones that was on there, we call him Harry now, because we don't want to give his name out, because he doesn't want his name released. But that was the first one. Chris interviewed him, and he took an Army friend of his along. Excuse me for a second. Actually, the first thing he did was call him up on the phone. He said, I understand you were on, I got your name here from Guy Fenn Sr. He said, oh, yeah, I know Guy. And he said, Chris said, well, he said, I understand you were on that dive in Shag Harbour back in 1967. And this guy here, he said, no, I wasn't on that. He said, yeah, he said, I got your name on the list here. And he said, he named off some of the other guys. He said, oh, yeah. He said, those are guys I dove with. He said, for sure. He said, but we didn't dive on anything in Shag Harbour. He said, were you told not to say you dove on in Shag Harbour looking for what might have been a crashed airplane back in 1967? He said, no, we weren't the ones that were on that dive. We were over off Shelburne. And Chris says, yeah, Shag Harbour's in Shelburne. He said, no, off Shelburne town. He said, the harbour, the mouth of the harbour. Chris said, you sure you're not mixed up now between Shag Harbour and Shelburne Harbour? He said, no. He said, we did 2 dives that year with that had to do with stuff underwater, like a UFO. He said, one was there and the other one was up at Pockwalk Lake in Halifax. And Chris said, what's that about? He said, well, some guy was there fishing with his son, and this thing came out of the water, practically right out from under their boat, about 25 feet across, and took off out of the water up into the sky. The Pockwalk chain of lakes up in Halifax, which is out around here. I don't want to get out too far off track, but is the water supply for Halifax. And now, it wasn't back then. But anyway, he said, Chris said, but he said, yeah, but I'm really concerned about this confusion about Shag Harbour and Shelburne Harbour. So he said, well, no, he says, that's where we did the dive. He said, Chris said, well, what did you dive on? He said, a couple of UFOs. He said, seriously? He said, yeah. He says, there was 2 UFOs off of the mouth of Shelburne Harbour. And he said, we had ships camped over them for about 7 days. He said, we dove on them and we took pictures. There were about 80 feet of water. And he says, well, what were they doing down there? He says, well, it almost, my impression was that one was maybe disabled or slightly disabled, and the other one seemed to be helping. And he said, what do you mean helping? He says, well, there was these things down there going from one to the other, and they were seemed to be working on the other one. He says, what kind of things? He says, well, things. He said, creatures. And he said, creatures. He said, yeah, I don't want to go any further than that on. He says, because I did, when I left the Navy, I had to sign an Undisclosure Act. He says, I could just say that there was creatures down there working on these things. Chris says, for God's sakes, what's this all about? Is he really, maybe there is something to the Shag Harbour thing, and that he just got this mixed up. So he said, well, look, he said, I'd like to come over, and you don't have a problem me coming over and maybe interviewing you and taping this to you? He said, no, what do I got to worry about? He said, they can't do anything to me now. He says, I'm retired from the Navy. So 2 weeks later, by this time, Chris had got the bunch of documents coming back from, the ones I showed you had come back from, down from Ottawa. And so he goes over to Harry's house with his wife, and when he gets there, Harry sort of stands in the door like he doesn't want to let him in. He says, you told us to come over, we could interview you. And he said, yeah. He said, well, all right, come on in. He said, but I really don't want to talk about this very much, and I don't want you recording it. He saw the tape recorder Chris had. He said, Chris says, well, what's the change of heart? Why don't you, you gave me the whole story over the phone. Chris kicking his butt now that he never, you know, taped it while he was on the phone. And he said, well, he said, no, he said, I've been advised not to. I asked some people, you know, and they said, no, you better keep your mouth shut about that. And but anyway, Chris did wheel the story out of him again. He just kept at him. The guy was getting more frustrated and angry and so on. But he pretty much told the same story. But this time he told it in front of Chris's Army friend there, Robert Armstrong, and who's since passed away, cancer. And Chris, you know, he really doesn't know what to make of this, because the guy is firm on the fact that he had been off the off of Shelburne Harbor, not Shag Harbour when they investigated. And he gave, you know, Chris had the names. He went around to some of the other fellas. One of the guys was in the hospital with throat cancer, couldn't talk, didn't want to talk. Another guy died before he got to him. He had died of cancer. It seems to be a hazard with some of these divers. The other fellow, who was the photographer, which we can't give you his name either, took pictures, but he lives up in Cornwall, Ontario now and won't give interviews. And the other guy, the last guy, I tried to interview. He was with Dominion Diving in Salvage and working out of Halifax, and they work a lot on ships and wrecks and so on and so forth. And he was a dive safety officer with that company. And he just refuses to say anything about it. He won't. The only thing he will do is admit that he was a diver in the Fleet Diving Unit back in those days, but he won't go any further than that. He won't even talk about any of his normal stuff, let alone this. I'm not going to be drawn into this, he says. I won't talk about it. And so, I don't know what to make of all of this. Chris is out at the West End Mall, up in this area, Halifax. One day he was doing something up there, and he runs across an old friend of his. He used to work at a newspaper with Chris. They were working in the circulation department. They used to deliver the bundles. And this guy we call Jim, I believe, and because that's his name. And he says to Chris, he says, what are you doing these days, Chris? And Chris says, well, come on out to the car. He says, I got something in the trunk I want to show you. So Chris goes out, and he has a loose leaf binder out there with some of these documents and everything. He starts opening it up and showing it to Jim. Jim's got a son with him, and he was kind of antsy to get going because he was taking his son to hockey practice, which is highly unusual in Canada. Anyway, Chris shows him the book, and Jim says, oh, yeah, I remember that. He says, but you know, the real story was off Shelburne that time. Chris said, what? He said, yeah. He said, you know, there was two objects on the bottom out off Shelburne Harbor at the same time the Shag Harbour incident was going on. Chris said, are you serious? Where did you find this out? He said, well, you know, I used to be in the Air Force. He was a maintenance technician in the Air Force. And he said, yeah. He said, well, how did you know about it? He says, because I was on one of the vessels that was out over this thing. Chris says, you're serious? He said, yeah. He said, what were you doing out on a vessel if you were in the Air Force? He said, well, one of my jobs with the Air Force as an airframe inspector and maintenance and so on was that I used to go out on crash sites where there was an aircraft went in or something like that, and I could recognize from pieces of the aircraft what aircraft had gone in, and that's acceptable. I'm sure, like Steve's out there somewhere. I can't see anybody from here, but Steve used to fly A4s. I'm sure that you know, you get to know certain airplanes, and you can tell from a hinge or a piece of rudder or something like that what the airplane was because you're so familiar with it. He said, so they dragged me out there. They had me below decks for 7 days. Supposedly they were looking at something on the bottom, and I didn't know what it was until one night we were in the mess, not the mess, but the Heaven's Supper on board the boat that I was on. It was a dive tender. It was the Provider, it was called in those days. No, Cape Scott, I'm sorry. And while we were sitting there eating, an officer came in and chewed out Harry. He says, Chris is, because he gave him the same name, he says, you knew him? He says, only from that time. He said, but he was one of the divers there, and he was being chewed out for shooting his mouth off about what they were looking at down in the bottom while they were eating their meals. And he said, well, he says what was really unusual was it was an American naval officer that was chewing them out. And I thought, what the heck was an American naval officer doing on a Canadian naval vessel chewing out a Canadian diver? He said, I don't know, but he was there doing it, and he had the authority to do it. And so he said, what did he say? He said, well, they were down there on the bottom. They were looking at these things, those creatures, as he called them. Chris says, God, creatures. That's exactly what Harry had told him. And he says, he says, Harry was kind of a bit of a maverick, he wasn't your typical military type. He didn't seem to want to follow orders right on the mark. And and he's pretty profane. And he said, we saw the cover story was a Russian submarine in the area. Okay, back in those days, there was only a 12-mile limit off Nova Scotia, not 200 miles. And he said that was the cover story that we were supposed to tell people, that there was a piece of a Russian submarine or something down there. And we all know it was no GD Russian submarine. And it was any effing submarine, this, that, and the other thing. Whatever it was, it didn't come from this planet. And, well, keep your mouth shut, because if, you can, the next thing you know, you're going to find yourself in detention, and house arrest or something, or arrested in barracks or something for the next 2 years. And, but anyway, so there was that part of the story. He said after that, he said on day 7, 2 of the destroyers that were on site all of a sudden took off to the east because there was reports, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes, how they would know this, of a Russian submarine, submerged Russian submarine, was coming up to the 12-mile limit, and they had to give pursuit. So the 2 RCN destroyers, Royal Canadian destroyers, went out after this. At this point, there was only 4 or 5 vessels left on site, and none of these were really what you would call the type of vessel that you could depth charge with, I guess. And at that time, the 2 UFOs that were on the bottom started to move, and they moved south westward down the coast of Nova Scotia. Now, we'll get to that part a little bit later. Sorry to keep hanging you guys up with this stuff, but this is a long story. I spent 3 hours one night telling this at a university, and I never did get finished. Oh, sorry, I better go back to the other thing. Well, I already mentioned about the bomb blast. That was that area there that's circled right up there. This picture actually was I had originally had up for it there, and it shows some of the sight lines for the stuff that they were seeing going that Chris saw that night. And over in there's Dartmouth Cove over there where he saw the object he saw. I'll go to this. This is a picture actually in 1961. It's only got the one bridge in it. There's another one going across over here now. But this area here is where the Mont Blanc blew up, and it just took this whole area right here, right out. And it was just total devastation. This was December the 6th, 1917. And then a blizzard hit that night, and it was in terrible shape. And before Canada, the Canadian government could lend assistance, because there was pretty primitive roadways and rail systems going on back in 1917. A medical train was made up in Boston. Came up from Massachusetts, loaded with doctors and nurses and medical supplies and everything, and it came up in the old Southwestern Railway into Nova Scotia. And to thank them for that, every year Nova Scotia sends Boston down this big, huge tree, spruce tree, that they put in front of City Hall down there. You might see it on the news every now and then, but that's where it comes from. They've been doing it since 1935. Anyway, that area was wiped out. So this had this has a connection to Shelburne. They figured during the Second World War, if something similar happened, and it would probably be even worse in the Second World War, because improvement on munitions and so on, that if the channel, and this was because this is the channel going over here in the basin, this is where most of the vessels would be. They'd be kept here. There was submarine net out the mouth of the harbor, and even though there's a rumor that when they did sink a submarine and they got some survivors off of them, one of the, I should say U-boat, when they got, one of the guys, they went through his coat, and he had a ticket for the Paramount Theater in Halifax. We don't know whether that's a true story or not, but it's kind of interesting that they could get in that close and take in a movie in Halifax. I don't know how they'd be able to understand unless they could understand English, though. But anyway, they had to keep this channel clear because because of the wreckage and everything else that was in this area. There was other vessels and structures on there that plugged up that part of the harbor. They needed another place to make up convoys, and the next best place was down the coast about 150 miles in Shelburne Harbor. It could take everything but capital ships, meaning aircraft carriers and battleships. It could take everything else. So it was set up, and it had rail systems going to it, so it could be supplied and so on. So that was the second alternate. They built a seaplane base down there, the Canadian Department of National Defense. It's DND up our way, and which will come into play in a few minutes.
Don, we'll wrap it up at 15.
The end of it?
Yeah.
What time is it?
We're already at 2 hours.
Good God. I'm sorry. All righty, I'm going to have to get to the end of this pretty fast then. So anyway, that was our connection to the Shelburne Harbor. And but what happened in Shelburne Harbor was back in 1948-49, after the war was over, the U.S. Navy went to the owners of that float plane base had been turned over to a private concern at that point, and because the government had sold it to them for $1 or something like that. There wasn't much to it, but anyway, that land and so on around there, and the U.S. Navy went to it, went to this concern and asked if they could purchase that land, and they set up a site there that was top secret up until about 1986. None of us knew. We always thought it was a Canadian U.S. marine geological or marine scientific project of some description. But it turns out that what the Americans were, which I call them Americans, I'm down here now so I can call you guys, I guess, the United States was doing was, or the U.S. Navy was doing, was building a Sousa base there. They had salted the North Atlantic all up to across the Bear Island, across the North Atlantic, right down across Greenland, and all the way down the continental shelf of eastern Canada, right down into the U.S. They had salted it with microphones. And what is that? Oh, and they had all of the equipment coming aboard at Government Point of Shelburne. I'll make sure I get to that stuff now. All right, here we got it. McNutt's Island. There's Government Point right there, and that's where the little float plane base had been. Now there was a top secret government site, and this is how we know now. They knew that there was something right about here in the water sitting on the bottom, because they were right on top of what was called a MAD grid, a magnetic anomaly detection, or magnetic detection grid, plus their microphone system that was coming ashore there. And this little lighthouse here, Cape Roseway Lighthouse, is important too. I'm not sure I'll be able to get the importance of that in. But apparently, when this thing went to the bottom, it set right down on the MAD grid, and so they knew this thing had, there was a grid of wires that they had set up underwater that could detect metal vessels, metal engines, and so on, crossing over it. And it extended right out to the continental shelf, well out, probably about 35 miles out to sea. And so if anything crossed over, it didn't matter whether it was commercial or military or what, or the Russians or submarines, they could detect it on the grid. Anybody remember Johnny Walker, the spy, U.S. Navy? Back in 1991-92, they finally busted him and his family, his uncle, and there was quite a few of the family involved in him. The information, part of the information he'd given to the Russians was about this, the microphone detection system and the magnetic anomaly detection grids they had set up in different places in the world. And the Russians knew about this, so they used to fool the system. This system would take, when a vessel came over it, it would read, the mics anyway, it would read the sounds coming off the hull and the engine noise, and they put it into a computer and store it. Even back in the 60s, they started this place they started back in 1949, but they had it into play by the late 50s. And but anyway, so they'd store that information, and the next time, and they'd assign a code name to it, and then the next time the thing came around, they'd know which vessel it was. And mostly they were looking for boomers or Russian nuclear subs, Soviet nuclear subs. But when the Russians found out about this, they did things to the vessel. They'd take the prop and they'd file a notch or put something on the prop to make it slightly out of sync. Maybe weld something to the hull, change the engine noise of the mufflers or something on their vessel, take the thing out again, it get re-recorded, assigned a new code name, and by the end of the war, the Cold War, the United States Navy thought that the Russians had 4 times more nuclear subs than they did, when in fact they had about the same amount. But they'd done it by fooling the system because of Johnny Walker. Anyway, they knew there was something on the bottom here because they picked it up on the magnetic detection grid. I was going to tell you this about what happened here at Cape Roseway Light during that time period. It was fogged in over that area. But I don't have time to get into that now. It's an interesting story that goes along with it that sort of agrees with what was going on there at the time, but there's quite a bit of a setup just to get into that. Okay, you heard about Harry. You heard about number 2 that you haven't heard about yet, but you heard about, oh yeah, that's Jim, sorry, RCF Intelligence. The Electronic Intelligence Officer, he was on a maritime patrol aircraft that used to fly, you know, off the coast to detect submarines. They drop sonar buoys into the water and chase them around. They had helicopters and trackers and so on and so forth. I'm going to give you a little bit more about him in a second. Then there was Earl, the weapons officer. These are all people that had heard about this story from different areas, no connection to one another, but had told us what had gone on, because they'd start hearing about the Shag Harbour incident on TV, and they'd start coming out of the woodwork. And there's more since then, too, even since I made this up. We know about Harry already. There's doesn't look like much, does it? Quite a bit of it's underground, but this is where it's been turned into a sound studio now for television and movies and stuff. You get a lot of movies shot in Nova Scotia. Anyway, Canadian Forces Station, CFS Shelburne. Sounds innocent enough, and that was the name of it all the way through, even though the Americans owned it, or you Americans owned it. And this is the SOSUS, what I was telling you about here. My little depiction of what it looked like up off of... there was a submarine involved here called the Onondagan. That was the story to do with Cape Roseway Light and Barry Kroll, the lighthouse keeper, and his friend. When these guys came ashore pretending to be commandos, they almost drowned. And their accent was so thick when they were talking, Cockney accent. They were a British crew, because this vessel had just come over from England. We just bought it, and was coming to Halifax Harbour and was diverted to Shelburne on October the 4th. It arrived there on the 5th. And it had almost entirely was British crew, because we didn't know how to sail them. And it had 3 Canadians on board and 30 Brits. And but I'm not going to get into that story. It's in the book. The airframe maintenance guy, and here's what they were using back then, the 4-engined North Star, which we called an Argus back then. Incidentally, the one that replaced that, we call it Aurora, and it's got nothing to do with the thought to be new high-speed Mach 10 aircraft that's been developed down here, if it even exists. But you know, we all have our suspicions. But anyway, this is what it had. The stinger at the back end was for magnetic anomaly detection. There's a radar under the chin, and it used to burn a lot of oil. You can see it all over the top of the wing there. But it also used to drop sonar buoys, one of which drifted up on shore over by the lighthouse on Grand Portage Island, or Rhoder Island as some know it. So there's a depiction of these things. What we think happened came out to sea, went up, and then they capped off of the McNutt's Island here, just off Government Point, about 2.5 miles out to sea. Now, this electronic intelligence officer on the Argus, the airplane I just showed you, said that they had been dragging up and down the coast constantly, looking to see if anything was going to come up to Shelburne or leave Shelburne. He said, this guy, they had talked about it over at Greenwood Air Force Base was where they would land, and where they had a squadron over there. He said, and we also had American Neptunes over there too. We had them as well. But the Americans, they were dragging up and down there as well, along with us. He said, we'd never ever seen this before. There was the two, you know, we did exercises together, but never an official operation like this where we were both going down into the Gulf of Maine, then coming back up the east coast of Nova Scotia, dragging back and forth across the bottom, constantly covering it to see if anything else was going to come in or leave. And they were, again, he got chewed out over, they were at a mess and they were talking about it amongst themselves, and the colonel at the base gave them hell for talking about it in the mess, you know, which is where they ate. And they call it a mess down here? That's what we call it. But anyway, the same thing happened to them as what happened to Harry on board the vessel. But anyway, his and the guy who had top secret clearance for weapons, which we called Earl, you saw his name up there, and one other gave us this same story, and one was Colonel Rushton, who was at Picaro. He was the CO in charge of the radar base at Picaro, which is the end of the Pine Tree line, which is the three lines, which is the north line, the Mid Canada line, and the Pine Tree line along. This was a early warning system, radar system set up. And this thing, they reported, this is what they told us, that it came in from, geez, I'm using the wrong one here, it came in over Siberia, came tearing in at 7,700 miles an hour, just this side of the North Pole and right over the magnetic North Pole, which at that time was right at that point. It's moved over this way a little since then. And right down through Baffin Bay, across northern Quebec and just west of Labrador, down over New Brunswick, and then across the Bay of Fundy, and then it went into the water at Shag Harbour. And three different military people told us this story, and the fellow that told us, who actually gave us all this information, it went at 7,700 miles an hour until it got to just about Baffin Island. By this time, NORAD had scrambled out of North Bay. They had scrambled jets out of North Bay in Ontario to go north, or F-104s. And this is serious, because you scramble north into that area, they ain't coming back. Those guys are going to have to bail out up there, because they didn't have any real fuel load if they were loaded with weapons. And they scrambled out of Labrador at Goose Bay as well. The Americans did. And so they had two squadrons heading up towards this thing. All of a sudden, just stopped on radar, and it stayed in one position for like maybe 2 minutes, and then it continued down at about 4,400 miles an hour, and then slowed as it came down closer to Nova Scotia. Because it stopped, they stood down. They knew right then and there it wasn't I mean, something come from Russia at 7,700 miles an hour. You got to be thinking ICBM, right? And you don't take chances on something like that. So anyway, they once it stopped and hovered for 2 minutes, they knew they weren't dealing with a missile here. So they recalled the aircraft. They didn't go chasing after them. They weren't going to risk them on a UFO. And the thing, they tracked it all the way down into Shag Harbour. Now, I am certain, beyond certain, as I'm standing here, that there's a big file somewhere on this case that we have and your people have down here in the United States, and to do with this particular incident, as they do probably with tons of other cases, and that we know it happened, and probably the story happened too. When you get a colonel coming out and looking you right straight in the eye and say, after his weapons officer said he was debriefed by him about this particular incident 3 years later. This was Earl. He had top secret clearance on special weapons and nuclear weapons, and he had heard about this case. And then one night he was out Cape Sable Island with his girlfriend, sitting down by the water, and all of a sudden these red-orange balls started coming in off the water. Well, this scared the hell out of him. So anyway, he goes back and reports to his base commander the next day, what's going on here? And by the way, I've heard about this incident in Shag Harbour 3 years ago when I was up in Cold Lake, Alberta. That was a big top-secret base where they tested all kinds of stuff up in Canada, up in Alberta. And so anyway, he said, I can't talk to you now. I'll talk to you in a couple of days about it, and I'll brief you on it. So, and he told him, then he told Earl exactly what I told you that we heard from the intelligence fella. And then the colonel later on finally admitted to it, but not without some pressure. He was a really nice fella too. He was retired at this point. He'd been selling, he was given the option of retiring as a colonel, or he could become a general by working at NORAD at Cheyenne Mountain. That's the way it works, is one Canadian and two American commanders on that base, CEOs at the base. That's the way it rotates. It's been going on that way since 1963. Well, they finally got it going about 66, but since they first started up the whole NORAD thing. And but you guys pay for most of it, but we get to command it every once in a while too. So anyway, when we finally nailed Rushton, we had the footage of Earl on the sightings program. He's backlit, mind you, and saying that he'd been debriefed and given this information by Colonel Rushton. And we're sitting there with Colonel Rushton running it by him, and he sat there and he looked at it, and Chris stopped the video and said, "What do you think about that?" And he said, he just looked us right straight in the eye. He says, "I have no information on that. I do not recall that." Well, we just kept pressuring him and pressuring him. Finally admitted to the fact that something happened that night. They were aware of it. I said, "Well, did you get radar on this thing at Picaro, where you were?" "Well, maybe we did, maybe we didn't." I said, "Well, what's the big deal? If you got radar on it, why wouldn't you tell somebody?" "Because I signed a non-disclosure act, and when I left the forces, they told me, you know, that there are certain things I can't talk about, and you know what they are, and I won't talk about it." Now, we've been told this by every one of those guys, the same thing. And one of the guys, the electronic intelligence officer, told us that he was ready to do the sightings program and talk about it. He called up Chris the night before the show started, and Chris called me. He said, "Look, Ted can't make it." That's his first name. I just gave that away. "He can't do the show." And he said, "Oh." I said, "Well, that's too bad. Why not?" He said he didn't say. It just wouldn't come down. So anyway, when I was interviewing everybody, re-interviewing everybody for the book, I got a hold of Ted, and we were talking about this. And I said, "Incidentally, why'd you bail out on the sightings program?" "Oh," he said, "well, I was told not to." I said, "By who?" And to make a long story short, he said, "I was eating my supper. The phone rang. A guy, when I got on the phone, a fellow identified himself as a ranking officer at DND in Ottawa, and we understand you're going to be doing the sightings program tomorrow night, and you're going to talk about the Shag Harbour incident." He said, "Yes, I am." He said, "We have, when you mustered out in 1972, you signed a non-disclosure act, and we're holding you to it, and you're not to talk about this." And he said, I was just flummoxed, you know. He said, "I didn't know what the..." And he says, "They just ordered me not to talk about it, so I couldn't talk about it." But Chris never thought to ask him why he didn't want to do the show, but I asked him, and that's what he told me. And but the guy had called them, or this fellow from Ottawa had called him. Now, a little story. How much? Have you got 10 minutes? Have we got 10, Steve?
Well, we're past it, but let's go.
All right.
For another 5 to 10 minutes.
Yeah, all right, whatever. Whatever I can get in here. I had 3 years ago, I was contacted by a fellow that's retired. He was a retired colonel from the Canadian Army. He was an engineer with the Canadian Army, and he's now working in the private sector. He said, "Listen, I have a fellow who's a friend of mine, and he gave me his first. I'll give you his first name is John." He said he'd like to talk to you about something that happened to him. And I said, "Okay." So we met. At a place that was called RA Park, which is Royal Artillery Park, which at one time had been a part of an Army base, but was now turned over to the retired military personnel and everything. They ran it as sort of a club. Anyway, I met this fellow over there, John, who had left the forces in 2002. So this was 2004. I was talking to him. And along with this other colonel I was telling you about, who introduced me to him and so on, and we got talking about it. He says, "I want to know," he says, "something happened to me when I was an umpire at war games up at Camp Gagetown in New Brunswick in August of 1995. And I was coming back, we were going back into Nova Scotia to Camp Aldershot, which was, there's an Aldershot in England, so it's named after that. And we were going back there, and we had to be back before 4:30, definitely by 5 o'clock in order to hit the evening mess, so they could have their supper. Me and my driver. Now, he was an umpire. Camp Gagetown is a big military operations area where they do war games all the time, and the United States Army comes up there all the time, and one is the enemy and one's the good guys, and they practice against one another to sharpen their skills. And it's a huge area, and just west of Fredericton, I might add, where Stanton Friedman lives. And but anyway, that had nothing to do with this particular incident, although there have been incidents up in that area. So he said we were coming across, cutting back through Nova Scotia, and I don't want to go all through the trouble of finding a map in Nova Scotia to show you this, but he was cutting across the northeastern part from where they'd come in, going through an area not far from where I flew my airplane from for years, a little village called East Gore. And but it's just before that, there's this very high hill that sticks up, and you can see, you're up at about 1,400 feet, and you can see for about 15 miles straight out and across in quite a wide expansive area. Not that that mattered much to them, but because they were up high over the village of East Gore, he said, we just come up over the hill and we stopped, and I know exactly where the spot is because I've seen it many times. He said, my driver, who's an 18-year-old reservist, just jammed on the brakes all of a sudden, and I looked up, and we're both staring at this thing sitting out there right in front of us over East Gore. Now, East Gore is down in the depression, down about maybe 800 feet below, on a slant, on an angle. It's not a steep area there. He said, we saw this thing in the sky. And I said, well, what was that? He said, it was a monstrous thing. He says it was bigger than a battleship. It's the hugest thing I've ever seen in the sky. And this thing really looked like it was bristling with weapons. And I got him to draw a picture of it. And basically he was drawing, a large triangle, but blunter. It wasn't as triangular shaped as the normal ones. More almost like more of a rectangle, but very irregular in shape. And I said, wasn't a cloud? He said, no, it was no cloud. He says, it was low enough that I was actually looking down on the top, hanging right over East Gore. And I said, well, geez, that's quite amazing. And he said, yeah. He said, it was 2:15. I looked at my watch, got out of the Jeep, and looked at my watch. It was in August, so they didn't have a top on the Jeep. And I had a good look at the thing. We looked at it for about 2 minutes, and all of a sudden, just like that, it vanished. I said, vanished? He said, yeah. I said, it didn't appear to move or anything. He said, no, just vanished. So I got in, and my driver, he got in, and he said, we both agreed at what we'd seen. He said, and I looked at my watch, it was 3:50. I said, what? He said, yeah. He says, this is what I want to ask you about. Have you ever heard of this before? And I had a breakout laugh, and I said, all the time. I said, that's classic. I said, so you lost almost 2 hours of time. He said, yeah. He said, about an hour and 40 minutes or so. He said, now I was really worried we weren't going to make the mess, And I said, God, this guy really likes to get to his food. But anyway, I said, he said, have you ever heard of that before? And I went on to tell him all kinds of different cases where this had happened. I said, but he said, well, how does it happen? I said, you blacked out. You were blacked out. He said, I don't recall anything. I said, well, all right, I have to ask you some other questions. And this is just more or less verifying, coming up to a point where he's going to verify something for me. But he did tell me that he had marks on his body that he couldn't explain and so on and so forth. I didn't ask him. I said, have you ever looked at your body and found some unusual, anything unusual on it? And he said, yeah, like a scoop mark here. And he had the classic abduction thing. And then I said, have you ever had anything like this before? He says, I was running a mission when I was a lieutenant back out of Laos into Vietnam back in the 70s. I said, now, wait a minute. You were in Laos running missions to Vietnam in the early 1970s? I said, you're in the Canadian Army. How could you be doing that? He says, oh, we did that. We did covert missions for the Americans all the time. I said, you're kidding me. He said, no, I'm not. He said, but I had this real weird experience. He said, I walked out of the radio in camp, or the radio hut we had set up there. We were going to be joining up with an American squad going in to ferret out, I forget what he said it was now, in a particular area. And he said, I was walking back towards the tent where my squad was, where some of the guys were. He says, because I was going to give them a briefing. And as I was walking along there, he said, and my adjutant was with me, and he said, all of a sudden, my father was standing there. I said, your father, how did he get over there? He said, well, he didn't. My father had been dead for 4 years at that point, but he was standing there. He said, don't do this mission. And I said, well, so what happened after that? He said, well, he was whoever this was, he said, I asked my adjutant, do you see anything there? And he said, well, I see something sort of hazy. And he said, but he said, so I said again, why can't we do this mission? He said, because it's dangerous. So anyway, he's figuring, well, we're in the Army, that's what we're here for. But anyway, it just vanished like that. He turns around, he goes back to his back to his CO, because he's only a lieutenant at this time. When I interviewed him, he was a colonel. He retired as a, well, he'd be a colonel then, but he was retired as a general. And when he went into the reserve, back into the reserve again, he was down to a colonel. Our rankings are a little different than yours are down here in the Army. But anyway, he said, I went back to my CO. He said, I just had something weird happen to me, and he didn't explain what it was. But he said, I have reason to believe that this mission could be a trap, or is very dangerous, or something bad's going to happen here. And he said, I just got a radio message. He said, that's been canceled. He said, a B-52 mission went over there and bombed the crap out of that area while the American squad was going in there, and it killed just about every one of them. And I said, for God's sakes. And he said, oh, I swear to God, that's what happened. He said, but I said, to this day, he says, I can't explain it. Well, I didn't bother getting into that. And I said, you know, we got into, the other fellow that was there, the engineer had mentioned that I was looking into the Shag Harbour incident. And one of the things I mentioned to him was about this ranking officer calling from Ottawa and ordering Ted not to speak about this UFO incident. And he says, oh, yeah, I've done that. I said, you phoned up people and told them not to talk, your personnel, not to talk about UFO incidents? And he said, no, not about UFO incidents, but some sensitive thing that was going on, and maybe they were going to talk to somebody, or we heard they were going to be doing a radio or TV or show or being interviewed with a newspaper, and we phone them up and tell them, pal, keep your mouth shut, because we can chop you down pretty quick unless you do. You know, I wouldn't identify myself and just tell them I was a ranking officer in Ottawa. And that usually did the... I said, you're kidding me. You actually did that stuff. He said, oh, yeah. So we had confirmation of that. So it was all these little things that kept coming up. There was a woman down, and we found out, Chris, I don't think was at that one. Shag Harbour has this little celebration of their incident every once in a while, about every 2 years. And 2 years ago I was down there, and I'd been told by the grandnephew of Braff Shand, who'd been out on the boat. He was shot to death 9 years later in a hunting accident. And but his nephew told me that he had access to a fella who was at the site that night, right at the Irish Moss plant when the thing went into the water. They watched it go onto the water. And I said, well, who is it? He said, well, he doesn't want his name mentioned right now, but he was with a girl. I said, well, who was the girl? He said, no, he won't say anything about that. He's being a real gentleman. And I said, oh, I see, okay. Anyway, when I was doing the Shag Harbour thing, we were talking about Shag Harbour. I was giving a little talk on Shag Harbour on the stage, like preaching to the converted there. And I mentioned about, there's somebody around here that was apparently sitting on the east side of the plant. There's like a little hill there between the building and the what's the name. You could sneak a car in there and not be seen. And that this man and a girl were in a car sitting there the night when it happened. And they saw it go down on the water. And this woman jumps up in the audience and says, that was me. And I said, she didn't have any problem owning herself, but the other guy was being a real gentleman, didn't want to give her name. So anyway, we got her name, and she was the third person that had been in that area that night that we didn't know about when we wrote the book. And, people keep popping up all the time. And that had seen this object. Another guy was a railway worker who stopped his car, rubbed his eyes. He got out, he said he saw the moon up there, and then the moon separated into two, just like out over the Bay of Fundy, only there was no moon that night. It had gone down at 5:30 that night. And this thing separated, and one of them came down, and right down in front of the Irish Moss plant. And I said, how'd you know it went in front of the Irish Moss plant? He says, because that's where I stopped. I saw this thing, cleaned my glasses off and looked at it, and it separated, and it came down, went in the water. So that was the second one. And, okay, I got about 2 minutes to go here. So anyway, finally he says, well, I'll get on with it. Just let me bring up there's the F-104, there's Picaro, the course there, Colonel Rushton, there's Colonel Rushton. He died of cancer a few years ago. The X-valve that was radioed in by the M.J. Nickerson that night, they had it on radar and and visually, and they watched the thing go down towards Shag Harbour that night, but about 8 o'clock in the evening. And there it is. It's actually got an X on the end of the what's name. The RCMP would keep that as an unknown. It slipped out somehow. Now this is the very last of it. Almost to the hour of the evening of the seventh day, 2 objects were observed coming out of the water at Woods Harbor, just above Woods Harbor, maybe a quarter of a mile where an object was observed going into Shag Harbour the next week, or the previous week. And they watched it climb up, hover for a while, and then it went off down across the Bay of Fundy. That's the RCMP report on it there. This is what he saw. The first thing was happening was his TV was going funny. And they had rabbit ears in those days, of course. And he went outside to have a look, and he called everybody out. These things were climbing up away from the water. And that's the post office at Shag Harbour. They actually have a cancellation stamp with the Shag Harbour incident right on it, with a little UFO and an island and a lighthouse with a boat on it. And they actually have this little green cutout that they keep up by the door. So they take it seriously down there, and it was the postmistress that had the, now they're having a stamp made up. Getting away with it, too. But, no, I don't know. That was just something they had a cutout. They've got a little Canadian flag on it there. But but they do sell. They have memorabilia in the inside there, right inside, and inside the post office. It's right there, almost down by where the dock is. And that house right next door to it, the garage you can see right next door, is where Steve said we're run out of time. And I hope you enjoyed this, because it's a really convoluted story, but there's an awful lot to it, and we keep getting more information on it all the time. Thanks very much.